The Storm of Steel, Ernst Junger. Translated by Basil Crichton, 1929. Moraineville. The train stopped at Bazincourt, a small town in Champagne, and there we got out. With unbelievable awe we listened to the slow pulsation of the machinery of the front, a tune to which long years were to accustom us. Far away, the white ball of a shrapnel shell melted into the gray December sky. The breath of the war passed by us with its peculiar horror. Did we imagine that nearly every one of us would be swallowed up in the days when the dull muttering over there broke out into unceasing thunder, one earlier, another later? We had left the lecture room, classroom, and bench behind us. We had been welded by a few weeks' training into one corporate mass inspired by the enthusiasm of one thought: to carry forward the German ideals of 1870. We had grown up in a material age, and in each one of us there was a yearning for a great experience such as we had never known. The war had entered into us like wine. We had set out on a rain of flowers to seek the death of heroes. The war was our dream of greatness, power, and glory. It was a man's work, a duel on fields whose flowers would be stained with blood. There is no lovelier death in the world, anything rather than stay at home, anything to make one with the rest. Our fevered thoughts cooled down as we marched through the heavy chalk loam of Champagne. Pack and ammunition and rifle weighed on us like lead. At last we reached the village of Moraineville, the rest place of the 73rd Fusiliers, a little spot typical of that neighborhood, consisting of 50 cottages built of brick or flint round a park-enclosed chateau. The traffic in the village street was strange to eyes accustomed to peace conditions. There were only a few uneasy and unkempt civilians to be seen. Everywhere there were soldiers in worn and torn coats, with tanned faces and thick beards, who went to and fro with long swinging strides, or lounging in small groups at the cottage doors assailed us newcomers with chaff. At one place there was a cooker smelling of bean soup, and surrounded by a ration party clattering dixies. The Wallenstein-like romance was heightened by the insipid dilapidation of the village. After spending our first night in a huge barn, we were paraded before the adjutant-lieutenant, as he then was, von Brixen, in the courtyard of the chateau, and told off to our companies, mine being the 9th. Our first day of the war was destined to make a very distinct impression on us. We were sitting in the schoolhouse, where we were quartered, having breakfast. Suddenly, there was a series of heavy explosions close by, and soldiers rushed from every house and crowded to the entrance of the village. We followed their example without knowing why. Again there was the peculiar whisper and fluster overhead that we had never heard, drowned in a terrific crash. I was surprised to see the men around me crouching as if bent under terrific pressure. Immediately after, black groups appeared in the empty village street, bearing black bundles on stretchers or on joined hands. A feeling of unreality oppressed me as I stared at a figure streaming blood, whose limbs hung loose and who unceasingly gave a hoarse cry for help, as though death had him already by the throat. He was carried into a cottage with the Red Cross flag over the door. What was all this, then? The war had shown its claws and torn off its pleasant mask. It was so mysterious, so impersonal. One had scarcely given a thought to the enemy carrying on his secret and malignant existence somewhere behind. The impression of something arising entirely from beyond the pale of experience was so strange that it was difficult to see the connection of things. It was like a ghost at noon. A shell had hit the entrance of the chateau and had struck a mass of stones and masonry into the doorway just as the inmates, terrified by the previous shell burst, were flocking out. There were 13 casualties, among them the bandmaster, Gebhard, who I knew well by sight from the promenade concerts at Hanover. A horse standing tied up at the steps realized the danger before the human beings, and breaking loose galloped unhurt into the courtyard. I could tell from talking to my companions that this episode had somewhat damped their martial ardor. It had affected me too. I seldom heard the rumble of a passing lorry without mistaking it for the sound of that deadly shell. In any case, however, it was our fate all through the war to start at any sudden and unexpected sound. Whether a train clattered by, or a book fell on the floor, or a cry rang out at night, the heart always stood still for a moment in the belief that some great and unknown danger threatened. It was a sign of living 4 years under the shadow of death. The effect upon the dark regions that lie beneath the consciousness was so deep that at the least interruption of the usual course, death started up with warning hand, or as he does in those clocks where he appears above the dial at every hour with sand-glass and scythe. It was a sensation over which habit could not prevail, since the instinct of self-preservation remains always the same. The notion that a soldier becomes hardier and bolder as the war proceeds is mistaken. What he gains in the science and art of attacking his enemy, he loses in strength of nerve. The only dam against this loss is a sense of honor so resolute that few attain to it. For this reason, I consider troops composed of boys of 20, under experienced leadership, to be the most formidable. On the evening of the same day came the moment we had so long desired, when, heavily laden, we set out for the line. On our way through Betracourt, whose ruins stood up fantastically in the dusk, to a lonely ranger's lodge concealed in pine woods, known as the Fancerie. This was the battalion reserve, and the 9th Company was in reserve till that night. We reported and were detained to our platoons, and soon found ourselves surrounded by bearded, mud-caked companions, who greeted us with a certain ironical good humor. They asked us how things were going in Hanover, and whether the war was going to end soon. Then the talk fell to laconic remarks about trenches, cookers, shell fire, and other matters of trench warfare. After a while there was a shout to turn out at the entrance of our hut-like shelter. We fell in with our sections, and at the command, Laden und Sitzung, we put a clip of live cartridges into the magazine with secret joy. Then, in silence and in single file, we went across country through the night, in a landscape studded with clumps of woodland. Now and then a single shot rang out, or a rocket fizzed up and after a brief and ghastly illumination, left the darkness blacker than before. The dull clank of rifles and entrenching tools was varied by the warning cry, "Look out! Wire!" Then suddenly a rattle and a crash and a curse. "Can't you open your mouth and there's a shell hole coming?" The corporal takes up the tale. "Shut up, blast you! Do you think the French have mud in their ears?" We get on quicker. The dark of the night, the glimmer of a Varay light, the slow flicker of rifle fire, induce a tremulous, alert state of the nerves. Occasionally a chance bullet sings by, cool and thin, overhead, and is lost in the distance. How often since then have I gone up to the line in a mood half of excitement and half of melancholy through scenes of utter desolation. Finally, we were lost to the sight in one of those trenches that wind like white serpents through the night to the front line. Once there, I woke to find myself alone and shivering. I was staring intently over the parapet at a row of firs in front of the trench, among which my fancy conjured up shadowy figures on every side, while now and then a stray bullet crashed through the branches. The only change during these almost endless hours was that an older hand took me by a long, narrow sap to a post in the front of the line, and there we occupied ourselves as I had done before, in keeping a lookout. For 2 hours after that I was allowed to sleep the sleep of exhaustion, in a bare hole in the chalk. By dawn, I was white and chalky as the rest. I felt as though I had lived this mole's life for months. The regiment's front was opposite the village of Legata in the chalk hills of Champagne. On the right was the destroyed Garnet Wood. Then the line zigzagged through large fields of sugar beet, among which the red trousers of those who had fallen in previous attacks were conspicuous, and ended in low ground, where touch with the 74th had to be maintained by means of night patrols. The beck flowed over the wire of a destroyed mill, surrounded by gloomy trees. It was an eerie spot to be in when the moon threw shifting shadows between rifts of cloud, and when strange sounds seemed to be mingled with the murmur of the water and the whisper of the reeds. Trench life here was as exhausting as it well could be. The day began before dawn, when every man had to be standing to. From 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., only 2 men from each section might be sleeping, which worked out at 2 hours sleep per man, and even this, owing to being wakened earlier, or having to fetch straw and one thing or another to attend to, was often illusory. Either we were on guard in the trench, or else we were out to one of the numerous posts which were connected with the front by long saps. These posts were intended to add security to the front line, but as trench warfare developed, they were found too exposed and were given up. This endless and terribly exhausting round of night guards was endurable in fine weather, and even in frost. They were a positive torture when it rained, as it usually does in January. When the wet penetrated first the ground sheet pulled over your head, then coat and tunic, then trickled hour after hour down your skin, there resulted a state of depression that was impervious even to the cheering sounds of the relief wading along towards you. The first light of dawn shone on exhausted, chalk-smeared figures that, with clattering teeth and white faces, threw themselves down on the dirty straw of the dripping shelter. Those shelters! They were holes hacked out in the solid chalk wall of the trench, and covered with a layer of boards and a few shovels of soil. When it rained, they dripped the whole day after. With a certain gallows humor, they were called dripping wells, men's baths, and so on. If more than one desired to take their rest in them, they were compelled to put their legs in the trench, where they formed excellent man-traps for passers-by. Under these circumstances, there was little question of sleep during the day, even if there had not been 2 hours on guard, cleaning the trench, fetching food, coffee, and water, and a lot else. It may be imagined that this unaccustomed life came very hard on us, particularly as the old soldiers were quite knowing enough to take advantage of us in every manner. They brought this habit with them from life in barracks, and in this way added some bitterness to days hard enough already. There was an end to it, however, when we had once been under fire together. The common soldier could not easily swallow the fact that we were volunteers. He took it to be a sort of bumptiousness on our part. I often encountered this notion during the war. It was not much better when the company was in reserve. Our quarters were small mud huts covered with branches of fir trees near the Fancerier, in the Hiller Wood, where the ground, deep in manure, gave at least the pleasant warmth of a hotbed. Many a time one walked in a puddle inches deep. Though up to now I had known rheumatism only by name, it was not many days before I felt it in every joint through, being always wet to the skin. Here, too, the nights were not for sleeping. They were used for deepening the numerous communication trenches. A ray of light in this scene of dreary monotony was the arrival of the cooker every evening at the corner of Hiller Wood. When the lid was taken off the dixies, a wonderful smell of beans and bacon or something else as delightful was wafted abroad. But here, too, there was a dark spot. Desiccated vegetables, reviled by fastidious gourmets as wire entanglements or damaged crops. Under January 6th, I even find in my diary the following indignant observation. In the evening the cooker waddled up and brought a filthy mess, probably stewed up out of frozen turnips. On the other hand, under the 14th there is an enthusiastic entry. Wonderful bean soup, 4 rations, pangs of satiety. We had an eating competition and disputed which position was the best for putting it down. I was for standing to it. The days of rest at Moraineville were the best. They were spent in having one's sleep out, cleaning equipment, and training. The company was quartered in a huge barn, which had two stepladder stairs as the only way in. We had stoves in spite of the building being full of straw. One night I rolled into one of them, and was awakened by the attentions of several of my pals who were making violent efforts to extinguish me. To my horror, I found my uniform was badly charred behind, and in consequence, I had to go about for a considerable time in a species of frock coat. After a short while with the regiment, we had pretty well lost the illusion with which we had set out. Instead of the dangers we had hoped for, only mud and work and sleepless nights had fallen to our lot, and the conquest of these called for a heroism that was little to our taste. The continuous exhaustion, too, was in part the fault of the higher command, which had not yet grasped the spirit of modern trench warfare. In a short war of movement, the officer both can and must take it out of his men without regard, but in a war that drags on, this leads to physical collapse. The immense number of posts, and the continual digging, were for the most part unnecessary and even harmful. Trenches are not the first thing, but the courage and freshness of the men behind them. Battles are won by iron hearts in wooden ships. Certainly in the trenches we heard a few bullets whistle, and now and then at a few shells over from the Reims forts, but these small experiences of war were far beneath our expectations. All the same, we were often reminded of the murderous reality that lay behind these apparently aimless incidents. For example, on the 8th of January, a shell hit the Fansnieri and killed Lieutenant Schmidt, the adjutant of the battalion. On the 27th of January, in honor of the Kaiser, 3 hurrahs rang out, and along the whole length of the front, "Hail to thee, Conqueror's Wrath" was sung to the accompaniment of the enemy's rifle fire. During these days, I had a most unpleasant experience which nearly brought my military career to an inglorious conclusion. The company was on the left flank, and towards dawn, after a night entirely without sleep, I and another had to do double sentry go in the low-lying ground. Owing to the cold, I had, against orders, thrown my blanket over my head, and was leaning against a tree. My rifle was resting on a bush close behind me. Suddenly, there was a noise behind me. Out went my hand. The rifle was gone. The officer on duty had slipped up behind me and got hold of it without being observed. As a summary punishment, he sent me armed with a pickaxe towards the French posts about 100 meters away, a Red Indian idea that nearly cost me my life. For during the course of my remarkable penalty patrol, a patrol of 3 volunteers crept forward through the rushes and was seen and shot at by the French. One, called Lang, was hit and never seen again. As I was standing close by, I got my share of one of those platoon salvos that was so much in favor, and the twigs of the willow beside me whistled round my ears. I clenched my teeth and stood where I was, out of pure cussedness. I have never been able to forgive this NCO, who soon after was severely wounded and got his discharge, for this dirty trick. We were all heartily pleased when we heard that we were at last to be taken out, and we celebrated our departure from Moraineville by a tremendous beer drinking in the huge barn. On the 4th of February, 15, we were relieved by a Saxon regiment and marched to Bazencourt. That month, the hardest of the whole war for me, was a good schooling all the same. It made me thoroughly familiar with the whole round of trench duties and fatigues in their severest form. This experience stood me in good stead later, when without it I might, as an officer, have demanded the impossible of my men. From Bazencourt to Hattonchâtel. At Bazencourt, a dreary little town in Champagne, the company was quartered in the school, which, owing to the really surprising feeling for order shown by the regiment, very soon had the appearance of a peacetime barracks. There was an orderly sergeant to turn us out in the morning, hut fatigue and roll call by sections at night. Every morning we marched out for a few hours' drill on the waste and untilled fields round about. After a few days, I left this busy scene of military duties and exercises. I was detailed to attend an OTC course in Recouvrance. Recouvrance was a remote little village hidden among delightful chalk hills. A certain number of the more youthful of us were sent there from the divisions to receive a thorough military training from a staff of officers and NCOs detailed by each regiment. Those of us who came from the 73rd had good reason, in connection with this course, to be grateful to Lieutenant Hope, an extremely capable officer who, unfortunately, was killed soon after. Life in this secluded spot was a strange mixture of the rigors of military training and the freedom of a university. During the day, we were licked into military shape in accordance with all the rules of the art of war. At night, we gathered together with our instructors, and in quite a radical manner, emptied enormous barrels of beer furnished by the canteen at Montcornet. While in the early morning hours we streamed out from our vast messes, the village street had the unusual appearance of a student's Walpurgis night. Our CO, a captain, had, however, the very educational habit of taking in hand the duties of the day following with a redoubled energy. Once we were actually kept at it for 48 hours at a stretch. The reason was this. It was our respectful custom to offer the captain a safe conduct to his billet at the close of a carousal. One evening, a godlessly tipsy fellow, a true simplicus academicus, who always reminded me of Magister Lankert, was entrusted with this important duty. He was soon to announce with beams of joy that instead of taking the old 'un to bed, he had accommodated him with a stall and a byre. Punishment was not long delayed. We had scarcely reached our quarters in hopes of a brief repose when the alarm sounded. With curses, we strapped on our equipment and ran to the place appointed. There stood the Olden, waiting for us in as evil a temper as can be imagined, and displaying an unusual energy. He greeted us with the shout, "Fire alarm! The guard-room's on fire!" Before the eyes of the astonished inhabitants, the fire engine was trundled out of its shed, and the hose screwed on, and the guard-room was then deluged with a magnificent stream of water. The Olden stood on some stone steps, like a grim Jupiter Pluvius, and took charge of the proceedings, urging us on from above to unstinted exertions. Sometimes his thunder broke over the head of some soldier or civilian who peculiarly aroused his anger, and he gave the order for him to be instantly removed. The unfortunate was hurried with all speed behind the nearest house, and so removed from his sight. When the morning dawned, we still stood with sinking knees at the pump. At last we were dismissed to get ready to go on parade. When we got to the parade ground, the Olden was there before us, brisk and spruce, and ready to devote himself with peculiar ardor to our insurrection. We treated the little episode for what it was, a cheerful interlude between two acts of war. Our intercourse with each other was very free and easy, for we all came from the same social class. 3 or 4 of us used to live and mess together. I still have a grateful memory of the scrambled eggs and fried potatoes for supper. On Sundays we had rabbit or fowl. As I was mess secretary, our landlady laid before me a number of chits she had from requisitioning soldiers. The substance of most of them was that Fusilier so-and-so had kissed the daughter of the house, and in return requisitioned 12 eggs. Unfortunately, this amusing bouquet, culled from the fields of folk humor, is too obscene to quote from. The inhabitants were surprised that common soldiers like us all spoke French more or less fluently. Sometimes a comic situation arose from it. I was sitting one morning in the village barber's with a friend called Clement. There were several villagers waiting, and one of them said to the barber, who was just setting to work on Clement with his razor, "Eh, coupez la gorge avec," at the same time drawing his hand across his throat. To his consternation, Clement replied quietly, "Quant à moi, j'aimerais muex la garder," thereby displaying the equanimity that well befits a soldier. The Frenchman said, that he'd like him to cut his throat, I believe, and Clement replies that he likes it better how he has it. In mid-February of the 73rd, we're taken aback by the news of the heavy losses our regiment had suffered near Perthus, and we regret having spent those days away from our fellows. On the 21st of March, after a brief examination, we went back to the regiment, which was at Bazincourt once more. At this date there was a parade and a farewell address by General von Emnick on the occasion of our leaving the 10th Corps. 24th of March we were entrained and conveyed to the neighborhood of Brussels, and there we were brigaded with the 76th and the 164th in the 111th Infantry Division. Our battalion was quartered in Moraineville, or the Flemish Herne, a small town in a pleasant Flemish countryside, and here on the 29th of March I spent a very happy 20th birthday. Though the Belgians had plenty of room in their houses, our company was, from false scruples, stuck in a great draughty barn, with the raw sea winds of that district blowing through it in those cold March nights. It was always, Belgium must not be treated as the enemy's country. That was a very natural consideration to show, but when once the military necessity of marching through it had been accepted, it was absurd to boggle over the petty consequences. It is in a war more important than may perhaps be thought, that the men should sometimes have beds to sleep in, and when no beds are empty, then some must be emptied. The soldier must have the first consideration. We sometimes make ourselves ridiculous with our misplaced human kindness, and might have taken more care of our dignity. The population, half Flemish and half Walloon, was very friendly towards us. I had many talks with the owner of an estaminet, a keen socialist and free thinker, who invited me to celebrate Easter Sunday with him, and even refused payment for what I drank. Such encounters are almost unbelievably welcome and beneficial after the rough companionship of the ranks. Towards the end of our time there the weather was fine, and tempted us to go for walks in the delightful and well-watered country round. The scene was made the more picturesque by the many naked figures seated all along the poplar-fringed stream, with their laundry on their knees, engaged in a zealous hunt for lice. As I had so far been more or less free from this plague, I assisted a friend, Pripke, to deal with his woolen vest, which was as populous as the habit of Simplicus Simplissimus of yore. So we wrapped it round a large stone and sank it into the stream. As our departure from Herne followed very suddenly upon this, it is likely that the garment enjoys a quiet resting place there to this day. On the 12th of April, 1915, we entrained at Hall, and to defeat the spies, were taken by way of the north wing of the front to the neighborhood of the battlefield of Mars-la-Tour. The company had their customary barn quarters in the village of Trouville, one of the usual squalid hamlets of Lorraine, whose flat-roofed, windowless houses looked like a lot of stone boxes thrown together in a heap. On account of the danger from aircraft, we had to keep ourselves close in the overcrowded place. In the neighborhood are the famous fields of Mars-la-Tours and Gravelotte. A few hundred meters from the village, the road from the frontier to Gravelotte was cut, and the French boundary post lay smashed on the ground. In the evenings we often had the melancholy satisfaction of a walk over the boundary to Germany. Our barn was so ruinous that we had to pick our way with care over what remained of the boarded floor, or else we found ourselves on the ground underneath. One evening, as our platoon was busied under the presidency of our esteemed corporal, Kirchhoff, in dividing out our rations on a manger, one of the huge oak beams of the timber roof came crashing down. By good fortune, it caught between two cob walls just above our heads. We got off with a fright, but our beautiful ration of meat disappeared for good beneath a shower of rubble. We had scarcely settled down again after this ominous disaster when there was a thundering knock at the door, and the voice of the sergeant major warned us to fall in. At first, as always on such occasions, there was a moment's silence. Then a regular stir-about. "My helmet! Where's my haversack? I can't get my boots on! You've got hold of my cartridges!" Oh, shut up! Finally, however, all was ship-shape and we marched to the railway station of Chamblay. whence we were conveyed in a few minutes to Pagnay-sur-Moselle. In the early morning we climbed to the heights above the Moselle, and came to a halt in Prenay, a romantic hill village, surmounted by the ruins of a castle. This time our barn was a stone one, filled with scented mountain hay, and through its window slits we look out upon the vine-clad slopes of the Moselle and the little town Pagnay in the valley, which was often shelled and bombed. Sometimes a shot hit the Mosellier and flung up a great column of water. The warm weather and the magnificent country worked on us like magic, and we went for long walks whenever we had time off. We were in such high spirits that at night we had to indulge in ragging before we could settle down to sleep. A favorite game, among others, was pouring water or coffee into the open mouths of the snorers. On the evening of the 22nd of April we left Prenay, and after a march of over 30 kilometers, reached the village of Hatton-Châtel without a single man falling out, and this with full pack. We pitched tents in the forest on the right of the famous Grandi Tranchée. Everything pointed to our being put into the fighting the following day. Field dressings, second tens of bully, and an artillery flag signal were given out. At night, in that mood of foreboding known to soldiers of every time, I sat a long while on the stump of a tree overgrown with blue anemones, before I crept over the others to my bed in the tent. And that night I had a confused dream in which a death's head played the leading part. Pripke, to whom I told it in the morning, hoped the skull was a French one. Les Esparres. The young green of the woods shone in the morning light. We went by concealed ways to the narrow gorge behind the front line. It had been given out that the 76th Regiment was attacking after 20 minutes artillery preparation, and that we were to stand by in reserve. Precisely at 12 noon, our artillery began a violent bombardment that echoed and re-echoed through the forest gorges. It was here we understood for the first time that dreaded word, drum fire. We sat on our knapsacks and waited in suspense. An orderly dashed up to the company commander. Hurried words. The first 3 lines are in our hands. 6 guns captured. We broke into a cheer, and the spirit of the offensive woke in us. At last came the longed-for orders, and we moved off in file in the direction of the faint crackling of rifle fire. It was war. Beside the path, in a dense plantation of firs, there were dull crumps, and earth and twigs came showering down. The laughter was a trifle forced when one of us, overcome by his nerves, flung himself on the ground. Then the warning cry of death came flitting among the ranks from the front. Stretcher forward. Soon we passed the point where we had broken through. The wounded had already been sent back. Blood-stained fragments of equipment and flesh were caught on the bushes all around. A strange and oppressive sight that made me think of the red-backed shrike that spits its prey on the thorns. The Grand Tranchée was full of troops hastening forward. Wounded men implored water and cowered against the wall of the trench. Prisoners carrying stretchers went panting rearwards. Chargers careered madly through the fire. On every side shells churned on the soft ground. Heavy branches fell to earth. Right in our way lay a dead horse with gaping wounds, and, beside it, smoking entrails. A bearded landsman leaned against a tree. "Boys, now for it. The French are on the run." We were in the battle-tossed empire of the infantry. In a circle all round the breakthrough, the artillery fire made a clean sweep of the trees. On the tortured ground lay the dead and dying that the attack had cost us, their faces toward the enemy, and their grey coats scarcely visible against the ground. A gigantic fellow whose red beard was smeared with blood stared into the sky, his fingers clutching the loose soil. Another, younger, lying in a shell hole, stirred and turned over. The shallowness of death was already on his face. He did not seem to like our looking at him. With a listless movement, he drew his cloak over his head and lay still. From here we went on in single file. Shells were screaming over all the time. Where they struck there was a flash, and the soil of the clearing was whirled aloft. Stretcher bearers. We had our first casualty. A shrapnel bullet had severed Fusilier Stoller's carotid artery. 3 bandages were saturated instantly, and within a few seconds he had bled to death. Nearby were 2 guns that could not keep quiet, and drew on us even heavier fire. A gunner lieutenant, who was looking for wounded, was knocked over in a column of smoke that went up at his feet. He picked himself up with marked composure and claimed solely back. We were greatly impressed. It was getting dusk when the orders came to advance. We went by an endless communication trench through thick undergrowth, much wrecked and torn by shell fire. The trench was strewn with kit and equipment thrown down by the flying French. Near Les Espargues, we had to dig ourselves in rocky ground, for there were no other troops in front of us. At last I sank down into a bush and fell asleep. Often as I dozed, I could see high overhead the shells of some artillery, or other described their ellipsis in a train of sparks. "Here, get up, you! We're moving forward!" I woke on grass wet with dew. As we were swept with machine gun fire, we made haste back into our communication trench again, and took possession of an abandoned French position on the outskirts of the forest. My attention was caught by a sickly smell and a bundle hanging on the wire. Jumping out of the trench in the early morning mist, I found myself in front of a huddled-up corpse, a Frenchman. The putrid flesh, like the flesh of the fishes, gleamed greenish-white through the rents in the uniform. I turned away and then stared back in horror. Close to me a figure cowered behind a tree. It wore the shining straps and the belt of the French, and high upon its back there was still the loaded pack, crowned with a round cooking utensil. Empty eye sockets, and the few wisps of hair on the black and weathered skull told me that this was no living man. Another sat with the upper part of the body clapped down over the legs as though broken through the middle. All round lay dozens of corpses, putrefied, calcined, mummified, fixed in the ghastly dance of death. The French must have carried on for months without burying their fallen comrades. Before midday, the sun broke through the mist and sent out a pleasing warmth. After I slept for a bit on the floor of the trench, I walked along its deserted bays. Taken by the attack of the day before, it was heaped high with mountains of provisions, munitions, equipment, weapons, and newspapers. The dugouts resembled plundered pawnbrokers' shops. Here and there lay the bodies of those who had fallen at their posts. Their rifles were still on the parapet. A trunk with head and neck shot away was clipped in among some riven woodwork. White cartilage shone out from the red and blackened flesh. It was hard to understand. Nearby a young fellow lay on his back, his glazed eyes and his fingers fixed in their last aim. It was a weird sensation to look into those dead and questioning eyes. It gave me a shudder that all through the war I never quite lost. His pockets were turned inside out, and beside him lay his pitiful plundered purse. Although I made up my mind to omit all comments from this book, I should like all the same to say a word or two about this first glimpse of horrors. It is a moment so important in the experience of war. The horrible was undoubtedly a part of that irresistible attraction that drew us into the war. A long period of law and order, such as our generation has behind it, produces a real craving for the abnormal, a craving that literature stimulates. Among other questions that occupied us was this: what does it look like when there are dead lying about? And we never for a moment dreamt that in this war the dead would be left month after month to the mercy of wind and weather, as once the bodies on the gallows were. And now, at our first glance of horror, we had a feeling that is difficult to describe. Seeing and recognizing are matters, really, of habit. In the case of something quite unknown, the eye alone can make nothing of it. So it was that we had to stare again and again at these things that we had never seen before, without being able to give them any meaning. It was too entirely unfamiliar. We looked at all these dead, with dislocated limbs, distorted faces, and the hideous colors of decay, as though we walked in a dream through a garden full of strange plants, and we could not realize at first what we had all around us. But finally, we were so accustomed to the horrible that if we came on a dead body anywhere on a fire step or in a ditch, we gave it no more passing thought and recognized it as we would a stone or a tree. I strolled along the devastated trench without being troubled by enemy fire. It was the brief respite before midday that often on many a battlefield I learned to welcome as a breathing space. I used this time now to have a look at everything quietly and comfortably. The enemy accoutrements, the darkness of the dungeons, the miscellaneous contents of the haversacks, everything was new and puzzling. I put French cartridges in my pockets, unbuckled a silk-soft ground sheet, and carried off a water bottle covered with blue cloth, and after 3 steps, threw it all away again. I was induced by a fine striped shirt, lying near an officer's ransacked valise, to pull off my uniform and change my linen, and I was delighted by the fresh, clean feel on my skin. In those days, no one imagined going on leave during a war, or being able to have a change of clothes. We fought till we were wounded, and wore the old shirt till the acquisition of a new one allowed us to throw it away. It was the length of the war that drove us back at last to our humdrum ways. Even Colonel von Oppen, who had sworn a mighty oath that there were 3 things he would never do during the campaign: have his beard trimmed, change his patched cloak for a new one, or take a pen in his hand, had at last to forswear himself. Now that I was rigged out afresh, I looked for a sunny nook in the trench, and, sitting on a piece of timber, I opened a round tin of beef and had lunch. Then I lit a pipe and read the numerous French newspapers lying all around. Most of them, as I saw from the date, had been sent into the trenches the day before from Verdun. Visibility was now good, and a German battery in a small wood just behind the trench began firing. It was not long before the enemy made the appropriate answer. Suddenly, I was frightened out of my wits by a mighty crash behind me, and a cone of smoke rose high up in the air. Unused as I was still to the multiple din of war, I was not able to disentangle the whistle and hum of our own guns from the rending crash of the enemy shells that fell with ever briefer pauses. And what puzzled me most of all was why it went on from all sides, as though the whizzing shells crossed each other's paths in a senseless maze above the maze of little trenches in which we were dispersed. I could see no occasion for all this activity, and it disturbed and puzzled me. I was still without experience of fighting, and I saw it as a recruit. The battle seemed to me to proceed as strangely and disconnectedly as though it were on another planet. At the same time, I had no fear, for I felt that I was not seen, and I could not believe that anyone aimed at me or that I should be hit. Indeed, when I rejoined my section, I surveyed our front with complete calm. It was the courage of ignorance. Towards midday, the artillery fire rose to a wild dance. It broke round us without pause. White, black, and yellow smoke mingled with their clouds. The shells with black smoke, called Americans, coal boxes by the old soldiers, exploded with a fearful detonation. In between one heard the familiar twittering of the falling fuses, like the song of canaries. It was odd that the birds of the forest did not appear to be in the least put out by this 100-fold clatter. They sat peacefully above the swaths of smoke and their shattered branches, and in the brief intervals of silence we could hear their love calls in untroubled song. Indeed, it seemed that they were urged on to song by the sea of noise that tossed around them. I sat with another man on a bench fixed into the wall of the trench. Once there was a report on the boarded loophole through which we were looking, and a rifle bullet passed between our heads and plunged into the soil. We were having casualties all the time, I could not tell what went on in the other parts of the trench, but the constant call for stretchers showed that the shelling was beginning to take effect. Now and then, someone hurried by with a fresh white bandage that shone out on the head or neck or hand and disappeared to the rear. According to the superstition of the trenches, there was no time to be lost in getting safely out of it with a light wound, for as it was often the forerunner of a serious one. My comrade, a volunteer named Cole, displayed that North German cold-bloodedness which seems peculiarly designed for such situations. He bit and squeezed at a cigar that never, after all, would burn, and he looked very sleepy. His composure was not disturbed when suddenly there were reports as of 1,000 rifles behind us. The shell fire had ignited the forest, and huge flames climbed crackling up the trees. At this moment, a man appeared at the corner of our fire bay and told us to follow on the left. We did so, through clouds of smoke. It was a ration party, just got back, and hundreds of abandoned pots and pans were cooking on the parapet. Who could eat now? A crowd of wounded with blood-soaked bandages pressed on past us, showing the state of their nerves in their white faces. Above, all along the edge of the trench, stretcher after stretcher passed along quickly to the rear. The feeling that we were in a tight corner began to take hold of us. "Look out for my arm! Look alive, man! Keep touch!" The trench ended in a wood. We stood aimlessly under the giant beeches. Our company commander, a lieutenant, came up through the underground and called for the senior NCO. "Swarm out and take up a line facing west. Then report to me in the dugout in the clearing." With a curse, the NCO took over. The impression made on my men by this occurrence was a standing lesson to me during the whole time I was in command myself. Later, I got to know this officer, who distinguished himself on many occasions, and I learned that matters of importance had detained him. All the same, an officer should never be parted from his men in the moment of danger on any account whatever. Danger is the supreme moment of his career, his chance to show his manhood at its best. Honor and gallantry make him the master of the hour. What is more sublime than to face death at the head of 100 men? Such a one will never find obedience fail him, for courage runs through the ranks like wine. We deployed and, wondering what to expect, took cover in a row of flat pockets hollowed out by some predecessor or other. We were calling out to each other and joking, when we were cut short by a noise that shook us to the marrow. 20 meters behind us, clods of earth were whirled through a cloud of white smoke and rattled through the treetops. Time after time the explosions rolled through the forest. With glazed eyes we stared at one another, and our bodies clove to the earth in utter impotence and prostration. Shell followed shell. Suffocating gases hung in the undergrowth. Dense vapor wrapped the treetops. Trees and branches came crashing to the ground. Loud cries rang out. We jumped up and ran wildly, hunted by lightning and stunned rushes of air. We ran from tree to tree, seeking cover and chasing round the giant trunks like hunted game. A dugout into which many ran got a direct hit that sent the heavy timber sky high. With the NCO I ran panting to a mighty beach, like a squirrel pursued with stones. Automatically, and starting back at one shell burst after another, I ran on after him, while he turned round now and again and stared at me with wild eyes and shouted, "What about these ones, eh? What about these?" Suddenly there was a flash among the interlacing roots, and a blow against my left thigh threw me to the ground. I thought I had been hit by a lump of earth. Then, I saw from the stream of blood that I was wounded. Later, I discovered that a splinter as fine as a hair had given me a flesh wound after expending its force on my purse. The shaving cut from the thick leather was as thin as a sheet of paper. I threw down my pack and ran to the trench we had left. From all sides the wounded converged upon it out of the shell-swept wood. The trench was frightful. It was blocked with severely wounded and dying men. One, stripped to the waist and with torn sides, leant against the trench wall. Another, from the back of whose head a triangular rent hung down, uttered piercing, agonizing cries without ceasing. And still, shell upon shell. My nerve broke down utterly. Without regard for anyone, I ran anyhow through the throng, and at last, falling back once or twice in my haste, climbed up out of the hellish tumult of the trench so as to have free passage and be open. I tore along like a bolting horse through the thick undergrowth, across tracks and clearings, till at length I found myself in a part of the wood near the Grande Tranchée. Close by was a dressing station, a dugout covered with branches. Here I spent the night among a crowd of other wounded. A worn-out doctor stood in the midst of groaning men, bandaging, injecting, and giving directions in a quiet voice. I pulled the cloak of one of the dead over me and fell into a deep sleep, disturbed by strange and feverish dreams. I woke once in the middle of the night and saw the doctor still at work by the light of a lantern. A Frenchman uttered every moment a piercing yell, and near me someone grumbled irritably, "Just like a Frenchman! Oh well, if they couldn't yell they wouldn't be happy." Then I fell asleep again. When I was carried out the next morning, a splinter bored a hole through the canvas of my stretcher between my knees. I was taken across the Grande Tranchée, which was still heavily bombarded, to the chief dressing station, and then moved into the church of the village of St. Maurice. Near me, in the jolting ambulance, lay a man with an abdominal wound, who implored his comrades to shoot him with the orderly's revolver. A hospital train stood under steam in St. Maurice station, and in 2 days we reached Heidelberg. As I saw the slopes above the Neckar wreathed in cherry blossoms, I felt a vivid pang of homesickness. How beautiful a country, worth bleeding for and dying for! The Battle of Les Eparges was the first I was in, and it was not at all what I had expected. I had taken part in a great military operation without coming within sight of the enemy. It was later that I experienced hand-to-hand fighting, that supreme moment of warfare, when the infantryman comes into the open, and when the chaotic vacancy of the battlefield has its murderous and decisive interludes. Duché and Monche. My wound was healed in 14 days. I was sent to the reserve battalion at Hanover and reported there as a cadet. After going through a course at Dobritz and getting further promotion, I went back to the regiment in September of 1915. I left the train at St. Lager, the headquarters of the division, and marched with a detachment of recruits to Duché, the headquarters of the regiment. On our front, the autumn offensive was in full swing. Over a wide stretch of country, the front line was marked by a swaying cloud of smoke. Over our heads were aeroplanes and the tack-tack-tack of their Lewis guns. Apparently, we were spotted from a captive balloon, for at the entrance of the village the smoke of a bomb rose in a black cone in front of us. I turned aside and led the column into the village by another route. Duché, the headquarters of the 73rd, was a village of moderate size and had not so far suffered a great deal from the war. It lies in the undulating country of Artois, and during our 1.5 years' fighting in this place of the front, it served us as a second depot and as a rest place where we could recuperate after hard times in the front line. How often we heaved a sigh of relief at the sight of a lonely light gleaming on a wet night at the entrance of the village. There one had, at any rate, a roof over one's head, and an undisturbed nook of one's own. One could sleep without having to turn out every 4 hours, and without being pursued even in one's dreams by the constant expectation of a raid. The first day of rest was like being born anew, when after a bath one puts on clean clothes and a well-brushed uniform. There were drills and games in the fields about, to loosen the joints and awaken a sense of comradeship among men who had spent the long and lonely nights on guard. From this, we got fresh zest for new and arduous days. At first, the companies used to march up in turn to the front every night. This exhausting double shift was later given up by the order of Colonel von Oppen, who showed in this his habitual common sense. The security of a position depends on the freshness of its defenders and their fighting spirit, not the length of the communication trenches and the depth of the firing line. Douchet had many innocent recreations to offer us. There were numerous canteens well provided with eatables and drinks. There was a reading room, a cafe, and later even a cinema in a large barn most skillfully converted. The officers had a splendidly equipped casino and a skittle alley in the vicarage garden. Often companies held festive evenings at which officers and men vied with each other in drinking in the good old German style. As the civilian population still lived in the village, all the space available had to be made full use of. The gardens were partially occupied with huts and temporary dwellings of one sort or another. A large orchard in the center of the village was used for the church parade. Another was made into a pleasure garden and called the Image-Platz. Here, in huts covered with branches, were the barber and the dentist. A large meadow near the church served as a burial ground. Nearly every day, one company or another marched there to bury one or more of their number. Thus, in the course of a year, the buildings appropriate to a garrison town overgrew the dilapidated village like a mighty parasite. The peaceful picture was scarcely recognizable. Dragoons watered their horses in the village pond, infantry training went on in the gardens, and all over the meadows soldiers lay and sunned themselves. Nothing was kept that did not serve a military purpose, and all that did was in perfect order. Hedges and fences were broken down or removed altogether to give better communications, while, on the other hand, at every corner there were huge signposts, shining and resplendent. While roofs fell in and all that was burnable went by degrees for fuel, the telephone and electric light were installed. The cellars were used as starting points for deep dugouts so that the occupants of the houses could have shelter during bombardments, and the soil was heaped callously in the gardens. A political economist could have studied here a small working model of the communist state, for in the whole village there were no boundaries and no personal possessions. The French inhabitants were in huts on the outskirts of the village towards Monchoy. They were mostly timid, pitiful figures who had suffered bitterly from the war. Children played without a thought on the threshold of the ruinous houses, and old men went with bent heads through the busy scenes that with brutal ruthlessness made the place where they had lived their lives no longer recognizable. The young people had to present themselves every morning before Lieutenant Oberlander, the town major, whose rule was a strict one, in order to have their tasks allotted to them in the cultivation of the land within the village boundaries. We only came in contact with the natives when we took our clothes to be washed, or bought eggs and butter. Intimate relations were very rare. Love had no place in this stark and devastating machinery. There were 2 French boys, orphans, one 8, the other 12 years old, who became attached to the troops in the most extraordinary way. They wore nothing but field gray, spoke fluent German, and saluted all officers in the prescribed manner. They spoke of their fellow countrymen contemptuously, and called them shangles, as they heard the soldiers doing. Their great desire was to go into the line with their company. They were proficient in drill, and fell in on the left of the company at roll call, and when they wished to accompany the canteen orderlies on an expedition to buy provisions at Cambrai, they duly asked for leave. When the 2nd Battalion went to Caen for a few weeks' training, one of the 2, called Louis, was, by order of Colonel von Oppen, to remain behind in Douchet, so that no occasion or false reports should be given to the civil population. During the march he was nowhere to be seen, but when the battalion arrived he jumped out of one of the transport wagons where he had hidden himself. Unfortunately, some of the more thoughtless of the men used to take them into the canteen for the amusement of teaching them to drink. Later, I believe, the elder was sent to an NCO course in Germany. Scarcely an hour by road from Douchet lay Monchay-à-Bois, the village where the 2 companies in reserve were quartered. This place was the occasion of bitter fighting in the autumn of 1914. At length it remained in German hands, and the fighting came to a standstill in the shallow ellipse round the ruins of the once prosperous place. The houses were now burnt and shot to bits. The waste gardens were churned up by shells, and the fruit trees split and riven. The wilderness of stone had been adapted for defense by trenches, barbed wire, barricades, and concrete emplacements. The streets could all be swept with machine gun fire from a central concrete emplacement, the Torgay Redoubt. There was another, the Altenburg Redoubt, an entrenched post on the right of the village, which concealed one platoon of the reserve company. There was a quarry, out of which in times of peace limestone had been got for building, and this was an important part of the defenses. It had been discovered only by chance. A company cook, whose bucket had fallen into a well of spring water, went down after it and discovered a hole that seemed to connect with a large cave. The matter was looked into, and a second entrance was broken through into a bomb-proof refuge that held a considerable body of men. On the lonely hill of the road to Ransart, there was a ruin that once had been an estaminet. It was called Bellevue because of the extensive view from there over the front. In spite of its danger, it had great attractions for me. The eye could travel for miles over the ruined landscape, whose dead villages were connected by roads, where no vehicle moved and no living being was to be seen. Further back were the faint outlines of Arras, the forsaken city, and further to the right gleamed the chalk mine craters of Saint Eloi. The waste and overgrown fields, with great cloud shadows flitting over them, checkered and crossed the network of trenches with yellow lines. Only here and there the smoke of a shell wavered up, as though propelled by a ghostly hand, and fluttered loose in the air, or the ball of a shrapnel hovered over the desert land like a great flock of wool, and slowly dissolved away. The face of the earth was dark and fabulous, for the war had expunged the pleasant features of the countryside, and engraved there its own iron lines, that, in a lonely hour, made the spectator shudder. The forlornness and the profound silence, broken now and then by the deep tones of the guns, were emphasized by the sad marks of devastation. Torn packs, broken rifles, pieces of equipment, and among them, in grim contrast, child's playthings. Shell fuses, deep shell holes, water bottles, torn books, broken utensils, holes whose mysterious darkness suggests a cellar, in which, perhaps, the bones of the unfortunate tenant may have been gnawed clean by the never-idle swarms of rats. A peach tree, whose supporting wall is gone, stretching out its branches for help. The skeletons of the domestic animals, still tied by their heads in their stalls. Trenches cut through the deserted gardens where, smothered among weeds, are seen onions, wormwood, rhubarb, and daffodils. In the neighboring field, stacks through whose thatch the corn is shooting. And all this traversed by a half-obliterated communication trench, and scented by the odor of burning and decay. The soldiers who walk among the ruins of a place like this, and think of those who lately lived their peaceful lives here, may well be overtaken by sad reflections. The line, as I said before, ran in a narrow half-circle round the village, with which it was connected by a number of communication trenches. Our front was divided into two segments, Monchy South and Monchy West. These were again subdivided into the 6 company sectors, A to F. The circular form of the position offered the English an excellent opportunity of flanking fire, and they made good use of it, inflicting heavy losses. I was sent to the 6th Company, and went into the line a few days after my arrival as a section leader. An unpleasant welcome awaited me, owing to the English toffee apples. C sector, held by the 6th Company, was the most exposed of the whole of our front. Our company commander at the time was Lieutenant R. Brecht, who had hurried across from America at the outbreak of the war, and a better man in defense of such a position could not be found. His fighting spirit was never behindhand, and it brought him at last a glorious death. Our life in the trenches passed very methodically. The following is a description of a normal day. A day in the front line begins at dusk. At 7, a member of my section wakes me from the afternoon sleep in which I have indulged in view of trench duty at night. I buckle on my belt, stick a Ray light pistol and some bombs in it, and leave my more or less comfortable shelter. First patrol of the familiar section of the trench assures me that all posts are properly manned. The password is exchanged in a low voice. Meanwhile, night has fallen, and the first Varay lights have taken their silver course up the sky. Eyes stare intently along our front. A rat rustles among the jam tins thrown over the top. A second joins it with a squeak, and soon the scene is alive with flitting shadows that stream from the ruined cellars or disused dugouts of the village. Rat hunts are a favorite diversion in the dreary round of trench duty. A piece of bread is laid out as bait, and a rifle carefully sighted on it. Or, the explosive is taken from the duds, strewn in their holes and ignited, till, with shrill squeaks, their singed bodies shot forth. Repulsive, nauseating creatures. Their rustling multitudes carry with them a penetrating effluvium, and I can never help but think of their secret doings among the dead in the cellars of the village. A few cats, too, have been drawn to the trenches from the destroyed villages in search of human company. A large white tomcat with one forepaw shot off was a frequent ghostly visitant of no man's land, and seemed to be on terms with both sides. But I was speaking of trench duty. Such distractions are welcome, and it is easy to be talkative, if only to fill the endless hours of darkness. That is why I, too, have stopped beside one of my men, a veteran of many scraps, or another NCO, and drink in with rapt interest all the little nothings he can tell me. As NCO, it is often my fortune in turn to be led into amiable talk with the officer on duty, who feels a bit lonely himself. He will even talk to me like a brother, in a low and earnest voice, pour out all his hopes and secrets. Nor am I behindhand, for the pressure of the hard black walls of the trench weighs on me too, and I have a longing for a little warmth and something human in all this unnatural loneliness. The talk flags. We tire out. Phlegmatically we stand in a fire bay, leaning against the trench and staring at the glow of each other's cigarettes. In frost, one tramps freezing to and fro, and the hard ground writes with all the footbeats. Very often it is raining. Then, with upturned collar, one stands under the penthouse entrance of a deep dugout and watches the monotonous descent of the drops. Suppose the step of a superior officer is heard approaching along the sopping trench. One leaps out, of course, and going a little farther on, whips suddenly round, and saluting with a crack of the heels, reports, "Sergeant on duty, all in order in the trench," for standing in the dugout entrances is forbidden. The thoughts go wool-gathering. One looks at the moon and thinks of snug and happy days at home, or of the great town far away behind where at this moment people are streaming from the cafes, and where the chief streets with their busy nightlife are brightly lit with arc lamps. It seems as though one must have dreamed all that ages ago. Then, something rustles in front of the trench. There's a sound of wire clinking. In a second every dream is shattered, and the senses are sharpened till they hurt. You clamber onto the fire step, and let off a Varay light. Not a sound nor a sign. It must have been a partridge or a hare. One often hears the enemy at work on his wire. At once, shot after shot is fired in the direction of the sounds, and not only because such are the orders, but because there's a certain satisfaction in it. We, too, take out wire nearly every night, and have many casualties doing it. Then, we curse the beastly swine, the English. Then, perhaps, there's a whispering noise followed upon a dull report. Trench mortar over. You rush for the nearest dugout steps and hold your breath. Trench mortar bombs explode with a very different and far worse noise than shells. There's something rending about them and treacherous, something personally malignant. They're insidious beasts, and rifle grenades are not much better. As soon as there are flashes from a particular spot behind the enemy front, all the posts leave the fire step and vanish. They know exactly from long experience where the guns are that are directed upon Section C. At last, the phosphorescent figures of your watch show that 2 hours have gone by, so you wake your relief without delay and get back to the dugout. Perhaps the ration party has brought letters or a parcel or a newspaper. It is a quite remarkable feeling to read the news from home and all its peaceful concerns, while the shadow of the flickering candle flits to and fro across the low, rough timbering overhead. After I have scraped the worst of the mud from my boots with a bit of wood, and given them a finishing touch on one of the legs of the primitive table, I lie down on the plank bed and pull my blanket over my head to enjoy 4 hours of sleep. Outside, the shots strike the parapet in wearisome iteration. A mouse flits over my face and hands without disturbing my sleep. I am left in peace even by smaller beasts, for the dugout was thoroughly disinfected only a few days ago. I am torn from sleep twice more to take my turn of duty. During the last spell, a light streak behind us in the eastern sky heralds the new day. The contours of the trench show up more sharply, and the impression made by the dawning light is one of unspeakable desolation. A lark soars up. I feel that its thrills underline the situation too obtrusively, and I am annoyed. Leaning on the parapet, I stare at the strip of ground in front bounded by our wire in a mood of utter disenchantment. Surely these last 20 minutes might come to an end. At last, there is a rattle of the Dixies as the party sent out for coffee comes back along the communication trench. It is 7 o'clock, and the round of the night guards is ended. I go to the dugout and drink some coffee and have a wash in a Bismarck herring tin. I am so cheered up that the wish to lie down again has deserted me, and at 9, I have to allot my section its tasks and set it to work. We are regular jacks of all trades, and every day the care of the trench makes its 1,000 claims on us. We sink deep shafts, construct dugouts and concerted posts, get wire entanglements ready, lay out drainage schemes, revet, prop, level, heighten, chamfer, and fill in latrines. In short, out of our resources we apply ourselves to every trade. And why not? What one can't do, another can. Not long since, a miner took the pick from my hand as I was at work on our platoon dugout and said, "Keep getting it out below, sir. It'll fall down of itself from the top." Fancy not having known such a simple thing as this all the while. But here, planted down in the middle of an empty waste, where there's the sudden and unanswerable compulsion of seeking shelter from the shot and shell and wind and weather, of carpentering beds and tables, of building hearths and stairs, a man soon learns to use hands. He sees the value of the handicrafts. At 1 o'clock, dinner is brought up the line in large vessels that once were milk cans and jam drums from the kitchen in a cellar at Monarchy. After dinner, a little sleep or reading, while gradually the 2 hours daily trench duty draws nearer. They pass a great deal more quickly than those of the night. One observes the well-known enemy position through field glasses or periscope, and often gets a shot at a head target with the help of the latter. But caution is necessary, for the English too have sharp eyes and good glasses. One of a post suddenly collapses in a stream of blood, shot in the head. His fellows tear the field dressing from his tunic and bind him up. "There's no use in doing that now, Wilhelm. He's still breathing, man." Then the stretcher bearers come and take him to the dressing station. The stretcher bumps heavily against the corners of the fire base. Scarce gone, and all is as it was before. Somebody throws a shovelful of soil over the red patch, and everyone goes about his business. One has got callous. Only a new recruit leans, white-faced, against the riveting of the trench. He's trying to see the hang of it all. It had been so sudden, such a terrible surprise, such a brutal and unspeakable assault. It can't be possible, can't be real. Poor fellow, there's something quite different in store for you. Often, too, it is quite jolly. Many of us take quite a sporting interest in the job. With a malicious satisfaction, we observe the hits of our shells in the enemy trenches. "That's a hit, my boy. God, see it go up. Poor Tommy." They delight in shooting off rifle grenades, or sending light mortar bombs over, very much to the disgust of frailer spirits. "Leave off that nonsense, man. We get stink enough without that." But nevertheless, these hotheads are forever puzzling out the best possible ways of slinging over bombs with homemade catapults, or of making the ground in front of the trench murderous with explosive machines. Perhaps they cut a narrow passage through the wire in front of their posts in order to entice an enemy patrol by this bait of an easy way through, straight up to their rifles. Another time, they creep out over the top and tie a bell onto the wire, and a long string with which it can be pulled in order to excite the English posts. Even the war is a joke to them. Afternoon coffee time is sometimes positively cheerful. Often the NCO is bidden to give one of the officers his company on these occasions. It is done with great punctiliousness. May I permit myself? Most obedient thanks. A delightful quality of the Prussian officers, this precision of politeness in all situations. It gives something firm and characteristic even to the youngest of them. On the tablecloth of a Hessian there is even the glimmer of 2 china cups. Afterwards the batman puts a bottle and 2 glasses on the rickety table. Conversation proceeds more confidently. Strange to say, here too it is the love of one neighbor that affords the welcome topics of conversation. A vigorous gossip of the trenches has evolved, and this is the mainstay of these afternoon visits. It might almost be a little garrison. Superiors, comrades, and those under one's command are subjected to a rigorous criticism. A new and engrossing rumor has just run through the platoon commanders' dugouts of all 6 companies from the right flank to the left. The observation officers who traverse these regimental front with telescope and sketch map are not guiltless of it. Indeed, the company sector is by no means a sealed compartment. Rather, it is a busy thoroughfare. Staff officers appear in the quiet morning hours and diffuse activity, very much to the annoyance of front-line swine, who has just got down to it after the last spell of trench duty, and at the horrid cry, "Divisional General in the trench!" hurls himself, buttoned and buckled again, up the dugout steps. Besides these there are the pioneer officer and the trench construction officer, both of whom behave as though the trenches existed only to display their special tasks. The artillery observation officer who wants to put down a trial barrage is greeted with particular coldness, for no sooner has he retreated again with his telescope and periscope than the English artillery is announced, and of course the infantry meets the bill as usual. Then, the officers in command of entrenching detachments roll up. They plant themselves in the platoon commander's dugout till nightfall, and drink and smoke and play Polish lottery, and at last leave a table as the brown rats. It is late when a little fellow flits like a ghost through the trench, creeps up behind the posts and shouts, "Gas attack!" in their ears, and then quietly ticks off the seconds it takes to get their masks on. It's the gas officer. Lastly, at midnight, there's a knocking on the plank door of the dugout. "Have you dossed down already? Here, sign on quick for 25 knife thrusts and 6 dugout frames." The carrying party has come. So it is that, at least in quiet times, there's an everlasting coming and going, till at last the dwellers in the dugout are tempted to sigh. If only they'd shell a bit, and then at least there'd be some peace. Outside, the heaped-up earth of parapet and parados gleam in the last rays of the sun, and the trench lies already in deep shadow. Soon, the first foray light will go up, the night guards are mounted, and the new day of the front-line soldier has begun. Trench warfare, day by day. Thus it was that our days passed in a fatiguing monotony, broken only by the short spells of rest at Douchet. Yet there were many pleasant hours even in the line. I often sat at the table of my little dugout, whose rough planked walls, hung with weapons, had the look of the Wild West, and enjoyed a pleasant feeling of being comfortably tucked away, as I drank a cup of tea, read, and smoked, while my Batman was busy at the tiny stove, and a smell of toast rose in the air. No one who has fought in the trenches has missed this mood. Outside, along the fire bays went the stamp of heavy, regular steps. A challenge rang out in monotone when someone passed along the trench. The dulled ear scarcely detects the never-ceasing rifle fire, or the short whack of a bullet striking, or the Verre lights that sizzle near the opening of the air shaft. It was then I took out my notebook from my map case and wrote down in brief the events of the day. So, as time went on, a conscientious chronicle of C Sector took shape as a part of my diary, a chronicle of one tiny snippet of the long front where we were at home and where at last we knew every overgrown bit of trench, every shelter whose roof had fallen in. Around us in heaped up mounds of earth lay the bodies of fallen comrades. On every foot's breadth a drama had been enacted. Behind every traverse fate lay an ambush, day and night, to snatch a victim. And yet, all of us felt a strong attachment to our sector, and had grown to be a part of it. We knew it when it ran as a black band across the landscape covered with snow, when at midday the flowery wilderness around it pervaded it with drowsy scent, or when the eerie paleness of the full ghostly moon caught in its web those dark corners where the squeaking companies of rats carried on their secret existence. On the long summer evenings we sat in its fire steps while the balmy air carried the busy hammerings or the songs of home across to the enemy. We fell over timber and broken wire when death drummed with his steel club on the trenches and a heavy vapor crept up from their shattered walls. Often the general wanted to give us a quieter part of the regimental front. Each time the company begged as one man to stay in Sector C. I am setting down here a short selection from which the notes that I wrote down on these nights at Monchy. 7/10/1915. Standing at dawn near my section's post on the fire step opposite our dugout when a rifle bullet tore one of the men's caps from front to back without hurting him. Just at this time, 2 pioneers were wounded on our wire. One shot through both legs, one shot through the ear. During the morning, the left flank post was shot through both cheekbones. The blood spurted in thick streams from the wound. To finish the bad luck, Lieutenant Ewald came to our sector today to photograph Sap Inn, which is only 50 meters from the trench. As he turned to get down off the fire step, a shot shattered the back of his head. He died instantly. Besides this, one of the men had a slight shoulder wound. 1910. The sector of the middle platoon was shelled with 15-centimeter shells. One of the men was blown against the boarding of the trench. He suffered severe internal injury, and a splinter cut the artery of his arm. In the early morning mist, while repairing our wire in front of the right flank, we found a French corpse that must have been months old. In the night, we had 2 casualties wire carrying. Gutschmidt was shot through both hands and one thigh. Schaefer through the knee. 3010. Owing to heavy rain in the night, the trench fell in many places, and the soil mixing with the rain to a sticky soup turned the trench into an almost impassable swamp. The only comfort was that the English were no better off, for they could be seen busily scooping the water out of the trench. As we were on higher ground, they had the benefit of the superfluous water we pumped out as well. The collapse of the trench walls brought to light a number of those who fell in the last autumn's fighting. 211. I took an entrenching party from the Altenburg redoubt to C Sector. One of them, Landstromsman Diner, climbed onto the ledge in the side of the trench to shovel earth over the top. He was scarce up when a shot fired from the sap got him in the skull and laid him dead on the floor of the trench. He was married and had 4 children. His comrades lay in wait a long while behind the parapet to take vengeance. They sobbed with rage. It is remarkable how little they grasp the war as an objective thing. They seem to regard the Englishman who fired the fatal shot as a personal enemy. I can understand it. 2411. A man of the machine gun company got a bad head wound while in our sector. Half an hour later, one of our company was hit in the cheek. 2911. Our battalion went back for 14 days to the little town of Q that lay in the divisional area, and was destined later to get such a sanguinary name. We went for training and to enjoy the blessings of life behind the line. While there, I got my commission as lieutenant and was posted to the 2nd Company, where I was to see many cheery times, and stiff ones too. We were invited to many a heavy drink by the town majors of Q and neighboring places, and had a little glimpse into the almost boundless sway that these village potentates exercised over their subjects and the inhabitants. The king of Q, as he called himself, a captain, was greeted on his appearance at table every evening with uplifted right hands and a thundering shout, "Long live the king!" He played the capricious monarch till dawn, and punished every breach of his etiquette and its very intricate formulations with drinks all round. We front-line fellows, and our innocence, came out of it very badly. Next day he was to be seen after lunch, in thin disguise, proceeding through his domains in a dog-cart to pay his visits on neighboring kings and do copious honor to Bacchus. Thus he made worthy preparations for the evening bout. He called it making a raid. Once he got into a dispute with the King of J, and sent a mounted military policeman to declare war. After several engagements, in the course of which 2 detachments of officers' grooms pelted each other with lumps of earth from small trenches furnished with wire entanglements, the King of J unwisely regaled himself with Bavarian beer in the Q canteen, and was surprised and taken prisoner while visiting a secluded spot. He had to ransom himself with a large barrel of beer. Thus ended the battle of these mighty ones. The inhabitants were under strict discipline. Trespasses and transgressions were speedily visited by the town majors with fines or imprisonment. Much as I am the disciple of the logical gospel of force, I was disgusted by the painful exaggerations of it I witnessed in those days, such as the compulsion upon all inhabitants, women included, to salute officers. Such regulations are pointless, degrading, and injurious. Such was our method, however, all through the war. Punctilious over trifles, undecided in the face of the severest injuries from within. On 11/12 I went over the top to the front line to report to Lieutenant R. Wetch, commanding the 2nd Company, which was in C sector. It gave me a shock as I jumped down into the trench to see how it had altered during our fortnight's absence. It had fallen in until it was nothing but a large trough filled with mud a yard deep, in which its occupants splashed sadly about in an amphibious existence. As I sank into my hips, my thoughts recurred with sorrow to the King of Q and his round table. We poor front-line swine. Nearly all the dugouts had fallen in, and the deep dugouts were flooded. For the next weeks, we had to work without respite merely to get firm ground beneath our feet. For the time being, I lived with Lieutenant Wetch and Boj in a dugout whose roof, in spite of a ground sheet suspended beneath it, dripped like a watering can. Every half hour the batman had to bail out the water with buckets. One morning, when, thoroughly wet through, I went up out of the dugout into the trench, I could scarcely believe my eyes. The field of battle that hitherto had been marked by the desolation of death itself had taken on the appearance of a fair. The occupants of the trenches on both sides had been driven to take to the top, and now there was a lovely traffic and exchange going on in schnapps, cigarettes, uniform buttons, etc., in front of the wire. The crowd of khaki-colored figures that streamed from the hitherto so deserted English trenches had a most bewildering effect. Suddenly, there was a shot that dropped one of our fellows dead in the mud, whereupon both sides disappeared like moles into their trenches. I went to the part of the trench opposite the English sap and shouted across that I wished to speak to an officer. Some of the English did in fact go back, and presently returned from their main trench with a young man who was distinguished from them, as I could see through my glasses, by a smarter cap. At first, we conversed in English, and then rather more fluently in French, while my men stood round listening. I put it to him that one of our men had been killed by a treacherous shot. He replied that this was the doing of the company on his flank, and not of his men. Il y a des cochons aussi chez vous, which I think means that there's a pig in your house, he remarked when some shots from the sector next to ours passed close to his head, and thereupon I made ready to take cover forthwith. We said a good deal to each other in the course of the interview in a fashion that can only be described as sportsmanlike, and would gladly at the end have made some exchange of presents in memory of the occasion. It has always been my ideal in war to eliminate all feelings of hatred, and to treat the enemy as an enemy only in battle, and to honor him as a man according to his courage. It is exactly in this that I have found many kindred souls among British officers. It depends, of course, on not letting oneself be blinded by an excessive national feeling, as the case generally is between the French and the German. The consciousness of the importance of one's own nation ought to reside as a matter of course, and unobtrusively, in everybody, just as an unconditional sense of honor does in a gentleman. Without this, it is impossible to give others their due. In order to be on clear footing again, we made a solemn declaration of war within 3 minutes of breaking off our parley, and after good evening on his side and au revoir on mine, I had a shot, in spite of the regrets of my men, at his loophole. It was returned at once, with one that nearly knocked the rifle from my hands. This was the first opportunity I had of surveying the grounds before the sap, for it was madness to show the peak of a cap at this dangerous spot. One thing I noticed was that there was the skeleton of a Frenchman just in front of our wire, whose white bones shone out from the rags of his blue uniform. Shortly after this conference our artillery fired a few shells on the enemy trenches, whereupon, before our eyes, 4 stretchers were carried across the open without, to my delight, a single shot being fired from our side. From the English cap badges we were left in no doubt after that day that we had the Hindustani Leicestershires opposite us. The weather towards Christmas became more and more dreary. We had to set up pumps in the trenches in order to make a show of keeping even with the water. During this time of mud, too, our casualty rate rose considerably above the average. For example, I find in my diary under 1212, "Today, 7 of our men were buried at Douchet, and 2 more have since been shot dead." And under 2312, "Mud and dirt got the upper hand. This morning at 3 o'clock a regular landslide came thundering down the entrance of my dugout. I had to set 3 men to work, and it took them all their time to bail out the water that poured like a mountain torrent into the dugout. The trench is waterlogged beyond hope. We are up to our waists in ooze. It is enough to make one despair. On the right flank, a dead body is coming to light, the legs only so far. We spent Christmas Eve in the line. The men stood in the mud and sang Christmas carols that were drowned by the enemy machine guns. On Christmas Day, we lost a man in the No. 3 platoon by a flanking shot through the head. Immediately after, the English attempted a friendly overture and put up a Christmas tree on their parapet. But our fellows were so embittered that they fired and knocked it over. And this, in turn, was answered with rifle grenades. In this miserable fashion we celebrated Christmas Day. On 28/12 I was the commandant of the Altenburg redoubt. It was on this day that one of my best men, Fusilier Hun, had an arm torn off by a shell splinter. Another, Heideting, was badly wounded in the thigh by one of the many stray bullets that whizzed round this low-lying strong post. My trusty August Kettler, too, was hit by a shrapnel bullet on the road to Monchy, where he was going to fetch my rations. The first of my many batmen. It got him in the windpipe and stretched him out. When he had started off with the dishes, I called after him, "August, don't you stop on the way." "No fears, sir." And now I was summoned and found him laying on the ground quite close to my dugout, drawing every breath with a raucous noise through the wound at the base of his neck. I had him taken back, and he died in hospital some months later. On this occasion, as on many others, what I found particularly painful was that the wounded man could not say a word, and only stared with helpless eyes, like a tortured beast, at those who had tried to help him. It always made one feel more than usually powerless in the face of another's troubles. The way to Monchy from the Altenburg redoubt cost, all told, a profusion of blood. It followed the further slope of a slight depression that lay 500 meters, perhaps, behind our front line. The enemy, who no doubt was aware from airplane photographs that the track was much used, made it his business to comb it out with machine gun fire at short intervals, or to sling plenty of shrapnel at it. Although there was a trench running beside it, and though there were strict orders to use this trench, everybody made a practice of going along in the open with the usual indifference of the old soldier to the risk of a bullet. As a rule, it was all right, but one or two victims were claimed daily, and this with time mounted up to a good number. Besides this, the builders of the Altenburg redoubt had placed a latrine in the very lowest spot of the valley, where the stray bullets from every quarter of the compass appeared to foregather, so that you were often compelled to fly for the open, clasping a newspaper in one hand and one's clothing in the other. Nevertheless, this indispensable institution was left undisturbed in its perilous position, a speaking example of the general indifference to danger. January, too, was a month of unremitting labor. Each platoon, with shovels, buckets, and pumps, first removed the mud from the immediate neighborhood of their dugout, and then, when they had solid ground under their feet, proceeded to establish communications with the sections on either side. In Adenfor Wood, where our artillery was situated, forestry detachments were employed in stripping young trees of their branches and splitting them in long sections. The walls of the trench were sloped off and entirely revetted with this material. Numerous culverts and sump pits and gullies were constructed, till by degrees the conditions of life were bearable again. On the 28th of January, 1916, a man of my platoon got a body wound from a splinter of a bullet that was shattered to bits against his loophole plate. On the 30th, another got a bullet in the thigh. On the 1st of February, the day of our relief, the communication trenches were being heavily shelled. A shrapnel shell fell just at the feet of Fusilier Young, my one-time cleaner of the 6th Company. It did not explode, but flared up, and he had to be carried away with severe burns. About the same time, an NCO of the 6th Company, who I knew well, and whose brother had been killed only a few days before, was fatally injured by a toffee apple he had picked up. He had unscrewed the fuse, and observing that the powder was smoldering, he put the end of his cigarette into the opening. Of course, the toffee apple exploded and wounded him in over 50 places. It was like this we were continually suffering losses through the carelessness that comes from constantly having to deal with explosives. Lieutenant Pook was an uncomfortable neighbor for this reason. He inhabited a lonely dugout in a tangle of trenches behind the left flank, and there he had shepherded together a number of enormous duds. He occupied himself with unscrewing their fuses and then examining them. I always gave this uncomfortable dwelling a wide berth whenever I had to pass by it. On the night of the 3rd of February, we had arrived in Douchet once more after a fatiguing spell in the line. Next morning I was sitting in my billet on the Emschmitzplatz, in the mood appropriate for the first day of rest, comfortably drinking coffee, when suddenly a monster of a shell, the herald of a heavy bombardment, exploded at my very door, and blew the window into the room. With 3 bounds I was in the cellar, where the other occupants of the house had also betaken themselves with astonishing speed, and there we presented a lamentable picture. As the cellar was half above ground and separated from the garden only by a thin wall, we all crowded into the short, cramped neck of the shaft. My sheepdog crept whimpering between our tightly packed bodies with an animal's instinctive desire for the darkest corner. Far away in the distance, one heard the heavy reports at regular intervals, followed within a few seconds by the whistling howl of the heavy lumps of metal hurtling through the air and ending in a crash after crash as they exploded all around our little house. Each time, an unpleasant rush of air came through the cellar window. Clods of earth and splinters rattled on the tiled roof, and in the stalls the terrified horses snorted and reared up. The dogs whimpered, and a fat bandsman, as each shell came whistling over, cried aloud as though he was going to have a tooth pulled out. At last the weather cleared, and we could emerge again into the open air. The devastated village street was as lively as a disturbed ant-heap. My quarters had a sorry appearance. Close to the cellar wall, the earth was torn up in several places. Fruit trees were snapped off, and in the middle of a doorway lay a long and sinister dud. The roof was riddled with holes. A big splinter had carried off the chimney. In the company orderly room next door, a few sizable splinters had pierced the walls and a large wardrobe and torn nearly all the officers' uniforms that were kept there. Their owners were very much incensed, but I myself was among those who escaped. On the 8th of February, C sector was badly shelled. Already in the early hours our own artillery landed a dud into the dugout of my right flank section. The inmates had an unpleasant surprise when it pushed in the door and overturned the stove. A witty fellow drew a caricature in which 8 men were rushing for the shattered door over the smoking stove, while the dud observed them from the corner with an evil wink. Besides this, at midday we had 3 dugouts smashed in. Fortunately, only 1 man was wounded slightly, in the knee, for everyone, even the posts, had been withdrawn into the deep dugouts. On the next day, Fusilier Hartmann of my platoon got a mortal wound in the side. It was from a shell from the flanking battery. On the 25th of February, we had a very severe loss through the death of a very fine fellow and a great favorite. Just before the relief, I got word in my dugout that Karg, a volunteer, had been hit in the deep dugout nearby. I went along and found, as so often before, a sad group standing round a motionless figure. The hands on the blood-stained snow were clenched, and the glazed eyes stared into the sky. One more victim of the flanking battery. Karg, when the first few came over, was in a trench and at once jumped into the shaft of the deep dugout. A large splinter from a shell that struck the wall of the trench just opposite flew into the dugout entrance and hit him in the back of the head when he thought himself in safety. He died in an instant, an unlooked-for death. The flanking battery was, indeed, very active during those days. Almost hourly it fired a single unexpected salvo, and the shell splinters swept the trench. In the 6 days from the 3rd of February to the 8th, it cost 3 dead and 3 severely and 3 lightly wounded. Though it was at the utmost 1,500 meters from us on a hillside on our left flank, it was beyond the power of our artillery to silence it. The only means we had of diminishing its effectiveness lay in increasing the number of our traverses and heightening them, so that the range of a shell burst was confined to short lengths of trench. With the beginning of March, we had the worst of the mud behind us. The weather was dry, and the trench freshly revetted, and now and then we had an hour or 2 of leisure and comfort. I sat every evening in my dugout at my little writing table and read, or talked when I had a visitor. We were 4 officers with the company commander, and we passed our days together on the best of terms. We met for coffee in the dugout of one or the other of us every day, or sat together in the evening over a bottle or 2 and smoked, played cards, and comported ourselves like soldiers of fortune. Those pleasant hours in the dugout outweigh the memory of many days of blood and dirt and exhaustion. They were, too, only possible during long periods of, comparatively speaking, quiet trench warfare, during which we became completely at home with each other and fell into almost peacetime habits. Our chief pride lay in our building activities, to which the gentry further back contributed very little. We sank a shaft of 30 steps near the other deep dugouts into the soft, chalky ground, and connected the two by a gallery at right angles to the shaft. By this means we could go in comfort 6 meters underground from the one flank of our platoon to the other. My pet enterprise was a gallery 60 meters long running from my platoon headquarters to the company commander's dugout, provided on the right hand and on the left with chambers of ammunition and living rooms. These places were of the utmost value during the subsequent fighting. When, after morning coffee, and one even got the paper pretty regularly, we met each other and washed and shaved in the trench, ruler in hand, we compared progress in our respective parts of it, while the talk turned on dugout frames, patterned dugouts, hours of work, and such matters. At night, when I lay down on my plank bed, I had always the pleasant consciousness of having, in my sphere, fulfilled the expectations those at home had of me. I had given all my energies to the defense of my 200 meters of the front line, and cared for the well-being of my 60 men. It was only now, when there was time for it, that I was able to experience this feeling to the full. In the winter months, we had not a thought in the trenches but of digging, and will this damned business never end? It is not danger, however extreme it may be, that depresses the spirit of the men so much as over-fatigue and wretched conditions. People who have leisure can afford themselves every luxury, even that of heroic feelings. This is true for the people as a whole. Its moral worth can only reach its full height when the pressure of work is not crushing upon any section of it. On the 1st of March, as I was standing behind a ground sheet with Landsman Ickman, who was killed not long after, a shell burst right in front of us. The splinters flew about us without a hit. When we took a closer look, we found that numerous fragments of steel, a length and sharpness that turned the stomach, had ripped the ground sheet. The men called these things rattles or grape shot, because there was nothing to be heard of them but a shower of splinters that suddenly whistled round you. On the 14th of March there was a direct hit from a 15-centimeter shell in the sector on our right. It killed 3 men and severely wounded 3 more. One of them disappeared without leaving a trace. Another was burnt black. On the 18th, the sentry in front of my dugout was hit by a shell splinter that tore off one cheek and the top of one ear. On the 19th, Fusilier Schmidt II, on my left flank of my platoon, got a bad head wound. On the 23rd, Fusilier Lohnmann was killed near my dugout by a shot in the head. On the same evening, one of my posts reported that an enemy patrol was on our wire. I left the trench with a few men, but nothing came of it. On the 7th of April, on the right flank of the platoon, Fusilier Kramer was wounded in the head by a splinter of bullet. We had a great many casualties owing to the ease with which the English bullets flew into fragments on the least impact. At midday, the neighborhood of my dugout was plastered with heavies for hours altogether. My skylight was smashed for the umpteenth time, and at every detonation there was a hail of hard lumps of soil through the opening. We drank our coffee, however, unmoved. Later, we had set a duel with a harebrained Englishman who showed his head over the parapet of a trench 100 meters away at the most, and got a succession of bull's eyes on our loophole. I and several others answered his fire when a perfect shot got the edge of our embrasure and filled our eyes with dust and gave me a very slight skin wound in the neck from a splinter. Nevertheless, we did not give in, but kept bobbing up and taking short aim and disappearing again. A moment later, a bullet struck Fusilier Storch's rifle and burst, covering his face with blood from at least 10 wounds. The next shot tore a piece from the edge of our embrasure. Another smashed the glass we used for observation. We had the satisfaction, however, after several shots had struck the parapet directly in front of his face, of seeing him disappear for the last time. Just after, I got the plate behind which this mad fellow had kept appearing time after time, with 3 shots of K ammunition, and sent it flying. On the 9th of April, 2 English flyers flew up and down just above our position. The entire trench strength rushed into the trench and opened a furious fire. I had just said to Lieutenant Sivers, who was standing beside me, "If only the flanking battery doesn't look lively," when the fragments of steel flew about our ears, and we jumped for the nearest dugout stairs. I advised him to come further in, when, smack! A splinter as broad as your head fell, still smoking, at his feet. Just afterwards, we had a few shrapnel shells as well that burst over our heads. A man was hit by a pin's head splinter on the shoulder, and small as it was, the wound was painful. I replied with a few rifle grenades, for it was an unwritten law of the infantry to confine themselves to the rifle. When it came to explosives, the retaliation was always at the least in the ratio of 2 to 1. Unfortunately, the enemy was so plentifully supplied with munitions that at first it took our breath away. After these excitements, we drank a few bottles of red wine in Sievers' dugout, and I became unawares so elated that, in spite of the brilliant moonlight, I walked home over the top. Losing my direction, I soon found myself in an enormous mine crater, and heard the English at work in their trenches close by. After I had made myself a nuisance by throwing them 2 bombs, I betook myself with all speed back to our trench, and on the way, fell foul on one of our foot angles consisting of 4 iron spikes. During this time, a fairly lively activity prevailed in front of the wire, and sometimes it was not without a certain savage humor. One of our fellows on patrol was shot at because he stammered and could not get the password quickly enough. Another time, one of the men, returning at midnight after a festive evening in the kitchen at Monchy, climbed out over the entanglements and opened fire on his own trench. When his ammunition was exhausted, he was hauled in and soundly thrashed. The Overture to the Somme Offensive. In mid-April 1916, I was detailed to attend an officer's training course at Courcelles, a little town behind the divisional front. The course was under the personal charge of the general director of the division, Major General Sontag. Theoretical and practical instruction was given in a whole series of military matters. The lessons in tactics on horseback with Major Jarotsky were particularly attractive. We made a number of expeditions to see the great organization that had been conjured up practically out of nothing in the back areas, and it gave us an idea, accustomed as we were to look down on all that went on behind the fighting line, of the immense amount of work that went on in the rear of the fighting troops. We saw the slaughterhouses, the commissariat depot, and the equipment for the repair of guns at Boyelis, the sawmills and Pioneer Park in Berlin Wood, the dairy and the pig farm and plant for turning carcasses to account at Inchy, the aviation park and bakery at Quinant. On Sundays, we motored to the neighboring towns of Cambrai, Douai, and Valenciennes, in order to see women for once. I had not been at all pleased to leave the front line in my platoon, to which I had grown more and more attached, but still, I used the time to rid myself completely of war and its clamor. I had books sent to me, and I read and wrote and rode and went for long walks, and made a collection of beetles, and in order to fight my rooted tendency to solitude, I was glad to spend my evenings in the mess, where there soon grew up that cheerful, careless spirit that is characteristic of a body of Prussian officers. It would not be right, in a book so full of bloodshed that I am afraid the ready may weary of it, to suppress a little adventure in which I played a somewhat comic part. When our battalion in the winter had been the guests of the King of Q, I had, as a newly commissioned officer, to inspect the guard for the first time. As I was leaving the place in search of a small guard posted in a railway station, I lost myself, and had to ask the way at a little cottage standing alone. The only occupant was a 17-year-old girl called Jeanne, whose father had died not long before. She now kept house there alone. After giving me the information I asked, she smiled and said, "Vous êtes bien jeune, je voudrais avoir votre avenir," which means, she said that he's very young and she wishes that she had his future. I gave her the name of Jean d'Arc because of the martial spirit that inspired those words, and when I was back in the trenches, I often thought of that bare and lonely cottage. One evening at Crozes, I suddenly had the impulse to ride over there. I had a horse saddled, and the town was soon behind me. It was an evening of May, as though designed for a romantic excursion. The clover lay in dark red billows over the meadows, whose hedges were white with May, and the chestnuts were like giant candelabra standing lit up in the dusk before the villages. I rode through Bullecourt and Ucoste, without ever dreaming that 2 years later I should be going over the top in an attack on the ruins of these very villages that now lay so peacefully with their ponds and hills behind. At the little station where I had inspected the guard, civilians were still unloading gas containers. I stayed watching them a while, and next the cottage gleamed out at me between its lilacs and red hawthorn, with its dark red tiles and the round lumps of moss. I knocked on the shutters, for they were already closed. "Qui est là?" "Bonjour, Jean d'Arc." I was given as friendly a welcome as I could have hoped. When I tied up my horse, I went in, and was invited to supper. Eggs, white bread, and butter, which was most appetizingly put on a cabbage leaf. My small hostess, meanwhile, displayed the ease of manners that one finds so often in France, among quite simple girls. So far there would have been no fault to find, but later, when I was leaving, a military policeman flashed a torch at me and asked for my credentials. My talk with the civilians, the care with which I had observed the unloading of the gas drums, and the unfamiliarity of my appearance in a district where there were few soldiers billeted, had all combined to awake a suspicion of espionage. Of course, I had forgotten my pay-book, and so I was hauled before the King of Q, who was, as usual, still in conclave at the round table. King and court alike behaved towards me with humor and discretion, and I was welcomed as one of the company. This time I saw the king in another light. The hour was late, and he discoursed of primeval tropical forests in which he had been employed for years laying a railway. He spoke well and vividly. We saw coast towns, with low white buildings gleaming out over the sea. Caravans vanishing within forests aswoon with heat, blue butterflies spreading their iridescent wings, and clusters of crimson orchids blooming in festoons from trees that hung over mighty torrent beds. The strange figure of the king was indeed a sign that even the strictest army organizations cannot so entirely mop up the personal element in life that nothing remains of a man but his functions. Here was an oddity luxuriating from the gray soil of the war, and I was too little of the soldier pure and simple to be annoyed by it. Hence, too, came the charm of my little adventure, to which there were other chapters to be added. Its charm lay in the contrast between its tender rural colors and the brazen background. The little pleasures that life offered borrowed an unimagined enhancement from the unceasing thunder of the guns, and from the destiny whose oppression never left one's mind. The colors were more affecting. The wish to knit oneself with life and enjoyment was more urgent. For the thought crept into everybody's mind, perhaps this is the last spring you will ever see. This gave an indescribable intensity to every expression of life, and after such an experience one can understand the peculiar wish of Stendhal. La perfection de la civilisation serait de combiner tous les pelles délicates du 19e siècle avec la présence plus fréquente du danger. Or, as Schiller expresses it in a manlier way, without the taint of decadence, be the summons tomorrow, yet today let us taste the crest of each moment too precious to waste. Be the summons tomorrow, yet today let us taste the crest of each moment too precious to waste. On the 16th of June we were dismissed to our units after a brief address by the general, from which we learned that the enemy were getting ready for a big offensive on the Western Front, and that the left flank of it would be just opposite our part of the line. It was clear to us after joining the regiment that something was in the air, for we were told by the others of the increasing activity of the enemy. The English had twice, without success to be sure, attempted a raid in force against C Sector. We had retaliated, after heavy preparation, by an attack of 3 officer patrols on the so-called Trench Triangle, and we had taken a good number of prisoners. During my absence, Lieutenant Wetch was wounded in the arm by a shrapnel bullet, but was again in command of the company soon after my return. My dugout had altered also. A direct hit had reduced it by half. The English, on the raid above mentioned, had smoked it out with bombs. The officers in command in my place succeeded in escaping by the skylight, but his batman was killed. The blood was still to be seen in large brown stains on the lining boards. On the 20th of June I was detailed to discover by listening in front of the enemy trench where the mining was going on. And at 11 o'clock I clambered out through pretty high wire entanglements with Fanrick, Wolgmut, Lance Corporal Schmidt, and Fusilier Parthenfelder. We covered the first stretch stooping, and then crawled on close together through the long grass and weeds. Memories of school reading books came back to me as I crept on my belly through the dewy grass and thistle stems, painfully anxious to avoid cracking the least twig. For 50 meters in front, the English trenches rose as a black streak in the half-light. The bullets of a distant machine gun fell almost perpendicular around us. Here and there a ray light went up and threw its cold illumination on the desolate plots of ground. Once there were 2 loud cracking sounds behind us. 2 shadows passed along swiftly between the trenches. Just as we made ready to jump on them, they vanished. Immediately after, the thunder of 2 bombs in the English trench told us it was 2 of our men who had crossed our path. We crawled on. Suddenly, Feinrich clutched my arm. "On the right, quite close. Gently, gently." Directly after, I heard sundry rustlings in the grass 10 meters to our right. With one of those lightning intuitions that come to one on such occasions, I saw the whole situation. We had been crawling the whole time along the English wire. They had heard us now, and had come out of the trench to examine the ground in front of them. Such moments on the prowl by night are unforgettable. Eyes and ears are stretched to their utmost. The sound of the enemy's feet coming nearer through the tall grass assumes the remarkable and portentous distinctness that takes almost the possession of one. The breath comes in gasps, and it is all you can do to suppress the noise of it. The safety catch of your revolver goes back with a little metallic click, a sound that goes through the nerves like a knife. The teeth grate on the fuse pin of the bomb. The fray will have to be short and murderous. You are aquiver with 2 violent sensations, the tense excitement of the hunter and the terror of the hunted. You are a world in yourself, and the dark and horrible atmosphere that broods over the wasteland has sucked you utterly into it. A succession of indistinct figures rose up close behind us. Whispering voices came to us. We turned our heads in their direction. I heard Parthenfelder, a Bavarian, bite on the blade of a dagger. They came still a few steps nearer, but then began to work on the wire, apparently without having observed us. Without taking our eyes off them, we crawled slowly back. Death, after towering up between the 2 parties in eager expectation, took himself off in disgust. After a time, we got onto our feet, and were soon safely back in the trench. The happy issue of our excursion inspired us with the thought of taking a prisoner, and we resolved to see about it the next evening. In the afternoon, when I had just laid down to get a little rest in view of our plans for the night, I was scared out of my wits by a terrific crash close to the dugout. Englishmen were sending toffee apples over, which, in spite of the moderate report they made when fired off, were of such weight that the splinters from them smashed the stout tree trunk posts of the revetment clean through. I clambered, cursing, from my cocher and into the trench, intending to jump down the nearest steep dugout with a shout of "Bomb left!" as soon as I saw one of those black fellows describe his circular course through the air. We were so generously provided with trench mortar bombs of every caliber and description during the next weeks, it became second nature when going along the trench to keep one eye aloft and the other on the nearest deep dugout entrance. That night, then, I once more prowled about between the trenches with 3 companions. We crawled on all fours right up to the English wire, and there took cover between scattered clumps of grass. After a while, several English appeared dragging a roll of wire. They stopped just in front of us and began cutting the roll of wire with wire clippers and talking in whispers. We crept nearer together in order to hold a muttered consultation. "A bomb in the middle of them, and then grab him." "But there are 4 of them, man." "Don't talk, rot." "Mind, mind." My warning came too late. As I looked up, the English crept like lizards under their wire and disappeared into the trench. We now felt somewhat uneasy. The thought that they would lose no time in bringing a machine gun into action gave me a nasty taste in the mouth. The others, too, had the same anxiety. With much rattling of weapons, we retreated on our bellies. There was a great stir from the English trench, hushed voices and a loud pattering of feet to and fro. Swish! Of a ray light. All around us it was light as day, while we endeavored to hide our heads in clumps of grass. Another ray light. Painful moments. If only one could sink into the earth or be anywhere else than 10 meters in front of the enemy's trench. One more, and then, ping, ping, the unmistakable report of rifle shots at short range. They've spotted us. Without any more ado, we shouted to each other our intention of making a dash for it, and jumping up, we raced for our own lines in a hail of bullets. After a few steps, I stumbled and fell into a small and shallow shell hole, while the 3 others, thinking I was done for, careened past me. I flattened myself to the ground and let the bullets sweep over me through the long grass. The burning pieces of magnesium from the falling Viray lights, many of which burned out close to me, was not much pleasanter. Gradually the fire slackened, and after a quarter of an hour I crept from my refuge, slowly at first, and then as fast as hands and knees would carry me. As the moon had set, meanwhile, I lost all sense of direction, and had not the least idea where either the English or Germans were. Not a glimpse could I see of Montchimel on the horizon. Now and then a shot from one side or the other whistled by with a very ugly sound. At last I lay down in the grass and determined to wait for dawn. Suddenly I heard a whisper close by me. Once more I put myself in fighting trim, and then prudently uttered a few sounds that might proceed equally from an Englishman or a German, and determined to reply to the first word of English with a bomb. I was glad to find they were my own fellows, who were just unbuckling their belts to carry in my corpse on them. We sat together for a bit in the shell hole, and rejoiced over our fortunate reunion. Then we returned to our own trench, from which we had been absent 3 hours. I was out again on trench duty at 5. In number 1 platoon I found Sergeant Major H. in front of his dugout. I was surprised to see him at this early, and he told me that he was lying in wait for an enormous rat whose gnawing and scratching prevented him from sleeping. He took the opportunity of showing me his dugout, which was absurdly diminutive, and which he had christened the Bantam's Perch. While we were standing together, there was a dull report which certainly did not betoken anything out of the way. H., who on the day before had very nearly stopped a large mortar bomb and was consequently very nervous, went like a flash for the nearest dugout steps and, taking the first 13 sitting, put the remainder to good use in 3 somersaults. I stood above in the entrance and laughed until I cried over this painful interruption of a rat hunt. The poor victim, meanwhile, was tenderly rubbing various parts of his body and attempting to put back a dislocated thumb. The unlucky fellow told me that he had been sitting at his supper when the mortar bomb arrived, and not only had his food been entirely smothered in dust, but on that occasion he had as well fallen downstairs. After this enlivening interlude, I had retired to my dugout, but I was not destined today, either, to have the refreshment of sleep. From early morning we were bombarded by trench mortars with ever-lessening intervals. Towards midday it got too lively for me altogether. With the help of a few men, I got our Land's mortar into action and started firing on the enemy trenches. It was, I must say, but a poor return for the heavy stuff with which we were so generously favored. We crouched on the sun-cracked ground in our little gun pit, and sweating sent over bomb after bomb. The English were not at all put out, so I had recourse with Lieutenant Wedgell to the telephone, and after mature consideration sent off the following SOS. Helen is spitting into our trenches. Nothing but great big bits. We want potatoes, all sizes. We had recourse to this rigmarole in case the enemy might be listening in. Very soon there came the comforting reply from Lieutenant Dykeman that the fat sergeant major with the stiff mustache and a few of his younger brothers were coming forwards. Immediately after, the first of our 200-weight bombs hurtled into the enemy's trench with an incredible detonation. It was followed by a few salvos from the field artillery, and after that we had peace for the rest of the day. At noon next day, however, the ball was opened in an even livelier fashion. At the first shot, I went by my underground gallery to the second line, and from there to the communication trench where we had made our mortar emplacement. We opened fire, and for every toffee apple that came over, we returned to Lons. After we had exchanged about 40 bombs, it appeared that the enemy had marked us down and was aiming for us. Soon, they fell to the right and left of us. But we kept on firing until one came straight for us. We pulled through our trigger line once more at the last moment and then ran for it. I had just reached the muddy trench blocked with wire when the brute exploded close behind me. The rush of air sent me flying over a bundle of barbed wire into a shell hole full of green slime, with a shower of hard clods hurtling after me. I got up half stunned. I was in an evil plight. Breeches and boots were ripped with barbed wire. My face and hands in uniform were plastered with mud, and one knee was bleeding from a long scratch. Somewhat put out of action, I crept back along the trenches to get a little rest. Apart from this, the enemy's fire had done no great harm. The trench was blown in here and there, a Priester mortar was smashed, and the Bantam's Perch was disposed of by a direct hit. Its unfortunate owner had already bestowed himself in a deep dugout. Otherwise, he would have no doubt seized the opportunity for a third fall downstairs. The firing continued all afternoon without a break, and towards evening rose to the pitch of drum fire with innumerable cylinder bombs. Our fellows called these cylinder-shaped missiles clothes baskets, and it often looked as though the sky was raining baskets. We sat in the deep dugout entrance in tense expectation, ready to receive all comers with rifle and bomb. However, after half an hour, the fire slackened off again. During the night, there were 2 more outbursts. The men on guard remained unmoved on the fire steps. As soon as the fire ceased, we made it a brilliant display of light rockets, and every man hurried out of the deep dugouts to assure the enemy by a furious burst of rifle fire that the spirit of the Hanover Fusiliers was not to be broken. In spite of this crazy bombardment, we lost only one man, Fusilier Deersman, whose skull was smashed by a mortar bomb that struck the parapet in front of him. Another man was wounded in the back. The day following this disturbing night, there were many bursts of firing to warn us of an approaching attack. The trench was shot all to bits during these days, and, owing to the broken timber of the revetment, was almost impassable. A number of dugouts were smashed in besides. Brigade headquarters sent forward an intelligence report. Intercepted English telephone message. The message gave precise information of the gaps in our wire and asked for steel helmets. Whether steel helmets is a code word for trench heavies is not yet known. Be prepared. We decided to stand to during the succeeding night. It was made known that everyone who did not answer with his name at the word hello would instantly be shot. Every officer had a red light in his pistol so that the artillery could have prompt warning. The night was even crazier than its forerunners. In particular, a concentration of fire at 2:15 a.m. beat anything that preceded it. A perfect hail of heavies fell in a circle all around my dugout. We stood in fighting order on the steps of the deep dugouts. The light of the candle end flickered on the moist and mildewed walls. A bluish vapor streamed in at the entrances. The earth flew from the edges of the trench. Whum! Damn that thing! Match, somebody! Be ready! One's heart beat in one's throat. Trembling fingers loosened the pens of the bombs. That's the last one! Outside! As we crowded out, one more with the delay action fuse went up and slung us backwards. Nevertheless, while the last of the iron foul came dropping in, and every fire step was already manned, we opened rapid fire, and the ground in front, wreathed in swaths of smoke, was brightly lit up with light rockets. When the firing had ceased, we had one more loss. Fusilier Nienhauser suddenly fell from the fire step and rolled bumping down the dugout steps into the middle of the group of his fellows assembled at the bottom. When we examined him, we found a small wound on the forehead and a puncture over the right nipple from which blood was flowing. It was impossible to say whether the wounds or the fall had killed him. At the close of this night of alarms, we were relieved by the 6th Company. We moved off down the communication trenches to Monchy in that peculiar brand of ill humor that is produced on exhausted nerves and sleepless eyes by a bright morning sunshine. From there, we proceeded to the reserve line, lying along the edge of the Arnefer Wood. A magnificent panorama of the Battle of the Somme and its opening stages was spread before us. The front-line sectors were veiled in clouds of white and black smoke, and one upon another of shell bursts towered up into the sky. Above them, the brief flash of exploding shrapnel could be seen by the hundreds. When at last we were hoping for a little sleep that night, orders came to load a heavy trench mortar ammunition to Monchy, and we had to wait the whole night, and to no purpose, for a railway wagon that had got hung up somewhere, while the English made numerous attempts on our lives, fortunately without result, by high-angle machine gun fire and shrapnel exploding directly over our heads. I was particularly annoyed by one artist with the machine gun, who fired at such an angle that the bullets, from mere force of gravity, came straight down on us. It was no good taking cover from them behind a wall. During this night, the enemy gave me an example of the closeness of his observation. In the second line, about 2,000 meters from him, a heap of white chalk was thrown up from a deep dugout that was being excavated for an ammunition dump. The English, unfortunately, were right in concluding that this heap would be removed the following night and sent over a salvo of shrapnel, by which 3 men were severely wounded. Next morning, I was roused from sleep once more, with orders to take my platoon as a working party to C sector. My sections were distributed among the 6th Company, and I then returned with a few men to Arnefer Wood and set them to work felling timber. On the way back to the line again, I went into my dugout for half an hour's rest. All to no purpose, for I was not to have a moment's peace these days. I had scarcely pulled off my boots when I heard our own artillery start a peculiarly lively fire from the edge of the wood. At the same moment my batman, Pook, appeared at the top of the dugout steps and shouted down, "Gas attack!" I snatched up my gas mask, pulled on my boots, buckled my belt, and, running outside, saw an immense gas cloud hanging in heavy white swaths over Monchy and rolling towards point 124 in the low ground. As most of the platoon were in the front line, and as an attack was very probable, there was only one thing to be done. I jumped over the entanglement in front of the reserve line and was soon in the middle of the gas cloud. I put on the mask, but quickly tore it off again. I had to run so fast that I could not get enough air through the intake. The eyepieces, too, were misted over in a second, so that I could see nothing. As I felt pains in my chest, I tried to at least get through the cloud of gas as quickly as I could. On the edge of Monchy, I had to pass through a barrage. The shells, interspersed with puff after puff of shrapnel, burst in an unbroken chain across the desolate country, which no one at the best of times ever traversed. Artillery fire of that kind in the open country where there is freedom of movement has never, either actually or morally, the same effects as among buildings or in trenches. In a moment I had the belt of fire behind me. But then I found myself in Monchy. A literal storm of shrapnel was breaking over it. Showers of bullets, splinters, and fuses whistled through the air, swept through the branches of the orchard trees in the garden wilderness, and crashed against what remained of the ruined walls. I found Sievers and Vogel, both officers of my company, sitting at a dugout in one of the gardens. They had made a blazing fire, and were bending over the flames to counteract the effects of the chlorine gas. I kept them company and did likewise until the bombardment slackened, and then went on to the front line by the No. 6 communications trench. As I walked along, I saw numbers of small beasts lying dead at the bottom of the trench, killed by the chlorine, and I thought as I saw them, another barrage will come down any moment, and if you go fooling about like this, you'll find yourself caught like a mouse in a trap. Nevertheless, I went on with the utmost concern. As it turned out, I was caught in a fresh and even wilder outburst just 50 meters from the company dugout. It seemed quite out of the question to pass even the short length of trench without being hit. By good luck, I saw a little shelter that had been dug out in the side of the trench for dispatch riders. It was only the width of 3 dugout frames, not much, but always something. So there I crouched and let the storm go over me. It seemed to me that I had chosen the hottest corner. Light and heavy toffee apples, Stokes bombs, shrapnels, rattles, shells of every description, till at last I could no longer distinguish one from another as they came droning, moaning, and crashing all around me. I had to think of my good corporal in the forests of Les Esparres, and his cry of horror, "What do you think of these ones, eh?" Now and then, the ear was utterly dazed by a single, absolutely hellish crash accompanied by a sheet of flame. Then, an unceasing and sharp swishing gave the impression again that hundreds of pound weights were flying after each other through the air with incredible velocity. Then came another dud, plunging with a short, heavy thump that shook the solid earth all around. Shrapnel exploded by the dozen, as prettily as crackers, scattering their little bullets in a heavy shower, with the empty cases whizzing after them. When a shell went up nearby, the soil rattled down in a torrent, and with it the jagged splinters as sharp as razors rent the air on all sides. It is easier, nevertheless, to describe all this than to go through it, for the brain links every separate sound of whirring metal with the idea of death, and so the nerves are exposed without protection and without pause to the sensation of the utmost menace. Thus I crouched in my little hole with my hand in front of my eyes, while all the possibilities of being hit passed through my imagination. I believe I have found a comparison that exactly conveys what I, in common with all the rest who went through the war, experienced in situations such as this. It is as if one were tied to a post and threatened with by a fellow swinging a sledgehammer. Now the hammer is swung back for the blow. Now it whirls forward till, just missing your skull, it sends splinters flying from the post once more. That is exactly what it feels like to be exposed to heavy shelling without cover. Fortunately for me personally, I always have the confidence at the back of my head that things will soon be better. One has the same feeling, too, at games, and though it may have no justification, it has at least the merit of relieving the nerves. And so this bombardment as well came to an end, and I was able to set out again, this time at top speed. Everyone in the front line, according to the regulations laid down for a gas attack and so often rehearsed, was busily greasing his rifle, which the gas had entirely blackened. A fanrick sorrowfully showed me his new sword knot, whose brilliance had been turned to a blackish green. As there was no movement in the enemy, I withdrew with my platoon. In Monkey, I saw a number of gash casualties sitting in front of the first aid post. They were pressing their hands to their eyes, groaning and choking, while water ran from their eyes. Their condition was no laughing matter, for some of them died a few days later in frightful agony. We had had a gas attack of pure chlorine to go through. It has a corrosive and burning action on the lungs. I resolved from that day onwards never to go without my mask, as I had done over and over again up to now, leaving, with incredible folly, my mask behind, and taking the case like a botanizing box, with a piece of bread and butter inside. On the way back, I went to buy something at the 2nd Battalion canteen, and there I found the wretched canteen keeper in the midst of a heap of goods all smashed to smithereens. A shell had come through the roof and exploded among his stores and turned them into a remarkable medley of jam and tinned foods and green soap. He had promptly drawn up a statement of losses incurred, amounting to 82 marks and 58 fittings, with true Prussian exactitude. In the evening my platoon, that had hitherto been detached party in the second line, was brought forward into the village on account of the uncertain state of the front. We were given the underground quarry as our quarters. We made ourselves comfortable in its numerous recesses, and heaped up an enormous fire. The shaft of the well served as chimney, as we could tell from the rage of certain company cooks who were nearly suffocated while drawing water. We had a double ration of grog, and sat on lumps of chalk round the fire and sang and drank and smoked. At midnight the salient in front of Monchy became an inferno. Dozens of alarm bells were ringing, hundreds of rifles were firing, and green and white rockets went up without ceasing. Immediately on this our barrage came down, and a trail of fiery sparks could be seen each time a heavy trench mortar fulminated. Through it all, whenever a human soul inspired the tumult, there rang out the long-drawn cry, "Gas attack! Gas attack!" A whitish wall of gas, fitfully illuminated by the light of the rockets, was moving over Monchy. As a strong smell of chlorine was noticeable in our cavern, we lit fires of straw at the entrances. The acrid smoke nearly drove us out of our refuge, and we were forced to clear the air by waving coats and ground sheets. Next morning, we had the opportunity of marveling at the effects of a gas attack. Nearly every green thing was withered, snails and moles lay dead on every side, and any dispatch riders' horses that were in Monchy had water running from their mouths and eyes. The ammunition and the shell splinters that lay everywhere were covered with a beautiful green patina. Even Douchy, lying far to the rear, shared the effects of the gas cloud. The civilians, who did not like it at all, assembled in front of Lieutenant Colonel Van Oppen's quarters and asked for gas masks. They were put in lorries and taken further in the rear. We spent the next night in the quarry again. In the evening I got the message that we were to have coffee at 4:15, as an English deserter had declared that there was to be an attack at 5. And in fact, I had scarcely been awakened by the return of the party sent for the coffee, when the now familiar cry, "Gas attack!" rang out. There was the sickly smell of phosgene in the air, and the drum fire on the Monchy was salient and terrific. It soon, however, died down. A lively morning followed. Lieutenant Brecht emerged on the village street from the communication trench number 6, with a blood-stained bandage round one hand, accompanied by one of his men with fixed bayonet and an English prisoner. He was received in the West headquarters and told us the following story. The English had released gas and smoke screens at 5, and at the same time smothered the trench with trench mortar fire. The men, as usual, left their cover before the firing stopped, and we had 30 killed. Then, 2 strong raiding parties appeared out of the smoke. One of the 2 had forced their way into the trench and taken off a wounded NCO. The other was held up on the wire. The only one who got through was taken prisoner by Lieutenant Brecht, who had led a planter's life in America before the war, and who seized him by the throat and shouted, "Come here, you son of a bitch!" The sole representative was now entertained with a glass of wine. With half-frightened, half-astonished eyes, he looked up the village streets that, deserted moments ago, was now crowded with ration parties, stretcher-bearers, dispatch carriers, and all whom curiosity could collect. The prisoner was a tall young fellow with yellow hair and the face of a child. A pity, thought I, as I looked at him, to have to shoot such a fellow as that. Soon, a long train of stretchers arrived at the dressing station. From the south sector, too, there were many casualties, for in Company Sector E also a strong raiding party had got into the trench. About 50 stretchers on which lay groaning men with blood-soaked bandages were set down in front of some huts of corrugated iron. Inside, the doctor, with his sleeves rolled up, was busy at his job. A young fellow, whose blue lips on a face as white as a sheet looked very bad, and was muttering, "It's all up. I shan't ever again. I've got to die." A fat medical corps surgeon looks at him with pity, and to comfort him kept murmuring, Now, my boy, now. Although the English had prepared for this minor attack, of which the chief objective was to divert some of our reserves from the front of the Somme offensive by numerous trench mortar bombardments and gas attacks, they succeeded in taking only 1 wounded man prisoner, and they left a number of dead in front of our wire. Certainly, our losses also were considerable. The regiment that morning had 40 killed, including 3 officers. At noon of the next day, we went back at last to our beloved Duchy for a few days, and the same evening we celebrated the happy outcome of the little affair with a few bottles of well-earned wine. On the 1st of July, we had the sad duty of burying some of the dead in our burial ground. 39 plain wooden coffins were lowered into the grave. The address by the Pastor Philippi was so affecting that the men cried like children. The text was, "You have fought a good fight," and he began with the words, "Gibraltar, that is your motto, and truly you have stood like a rock in a raging sea." The great value of ceremonial observances was made clear to me on this affecting occasion. We have often, one time and another, left 10 times the number of dead on the field, and yet not been so deeply touched by the loss as we were that day beside the open graves. I learned during these days to value at their true worth the men with whom I still had 3 more years of fighting to go through. You will not find a man in the whole army who can be relied upon so implicitly to do his duty, and without fuss, as the man of Lower Saxony. When there was the need to prove, "Here stands a man, and if need be, here he falls," not one of them ever wavered. It showed great self-mastery to leave the security of the deep dugout and face the storm of fire during those days in the trenches, when the trench mortar bombs were exploding by the 100, and when the flanking batteries swept us with shrapnel, and when bits and splinters were hurtling all ways. In the open field there might be some simple pleasure in showing your courage, but it is another thing to clench your teeth and go to your post alone in the night and under fire. It is just this quality of courage that I have always marveled at in those quiet, fair-haired Saxons. On the evening of the 3rd of July, we went back to the line. It was comparatively quiet, though there were still signs of there being something in the wind. The machine never ceased to throb and hammer. We often intercepted suspicious telephone conversations about gas containers and mines addressed to an English RE officer in the front line. From the early morning to dusk, enemy aeroplanes kept our trenches under fire. The average daily bombardments were much heavier than usual. In spite of this, we were relieved on the 12th July without having any unpleasant experiences and went into reserve at Monchy. On the evening of the 13th of July, our dugouts in the garden were under heavy fire from a 24-centimeter naval gun. The heavy shells came whistling over and exploded with a really frightful noise. During the night, we were awakened by a lively firing and a gas attack. We sat in the dugout around the stove with our masks on. Vogel, who could not find his, ran to and fro in great distress, while some of his comrades, who bore him no love, took a malicious joy in declaring that the smell of the gas was getting stronger every moment. At last, I gave him my spare refill, and he hugged the smoking stove for an hour like an image of misery, and coughed and held his nose with a piteous air, and pulled away at the mouthpiece. On the same day, I had 2 casualties in my platoon. Hasselmann with a rifle wound in the arm, and Maschmeyer with a shrapnel bullet in the neck. No attack followed that night. Nevertheless, it was a bad business and cost the regiment 25 dead and many wounded. On the 15th and 17th, we had 2 more gas attacks to go through. On the 17th, we were relieved, and we were twice shelled in Douchy. Once while Major von Jarotsky was addressing the assembled officers in an orchard. It was irresistibly comic, in spite of the danger, to see how the company flew apart, nearly falling on their noses in their extreme haste to get through the fences and vanish like lightning wherever cover was to be found. In the garden of my billet, a little girl of 8 years old was killed by a shell while rummaging for rubbish in a pit. On the 20th of July, we were back on the line. On the 28th, I arranged with Wohlgemuth and the volunteers, Bartels and Berkner, to go on patrol. We had no other object in mind than to make a little tour on the other side of the wire and to see what no man's land might bring forth, for trench life had become, by degree, to be monotonous again. In the afternoon, Lieutenant Bronze of the 6th Company, who was relieving me, paid me a visit in the dugout and brought 1 or 2 bottles of good wine with him. It was 11:30 when we broke up the meeting, and then I went into the trench, where I found my 3 comrades standing together in the dark corner of a traverse. After picking out a few dry bombs, I climbed over the wire in the best of spirits, while Bronze shouted after me, "Give 'em hell!" It was not long before we had stalked the enemy wire. Close in front of it, in high grass, we discovered a stout and well-insulated wire. I thought the discovery might have some importance, and I told Wohlgemuth to cut a piece off and take it back with him. While he was employed with a cigar cutter in default of a better instrument, there was a clink of wire immediately in front of us, and a party of English appeared and began to work on the wire without observing us in the grass. With the annoying experience of previous patrols in my mind, I breathed an almost inaudible, "Wohlgemuth, bomb in the middle of them." "Better leave them to get to work, sir." "An order's an order, Feinrich." The spirit of the Prussian drill yard did not fail to breathe its spell even in this wilderness. I heard the dry rasp of the fuse pin as he pulled it out, and I had the doomed feelings of a man who has let himself in for a very uncertain adventure. I saw Wohlgemuth lob the bomb along the ground in order to show himself as little as possible. It stopped in some weeds, almost at the feet of the English, who clearly had noticed nothing. A few moments of intense expectation went by. Then a bang and a flash lit up the reeling figures. We sprang like tigers into the white cloud of smoke with a shout, "You are prisoners!" In less than a second, all was confusion. I held my pistol against a face that shone out like a white mask in the darkness. A shadow squeezed backwards into the wire and cried out. Close to me on my left, Wilgum had fired his revolver, while the volunteer, Bartles, in the excitement of the moment, blindly slung a bomb in the midst of us. At the first shot, the magazine of my pistol dropped out, and I stood shouting at an Englishman who squeezed himself in horror closer and closer against the barbed wire. Again and again I pressed the trigger, but not a shot rang out. It was a nightmare. There was now a tumult in the trench. Shouts were followed by the rattle of a Lewis gun. We jumped back. I took cover in a shell hole and turned my pistol on the shadow behind me. This time it was lucky I could not fire, for it was Berkner behind me, though I had thought he had long since got back. After this, we made a dash for our own trench. But in front of our wire, the bullets came so thick that I had to jump into a crater full of water and laced over with wire. Swinging on a barbed hammock over the face of the waters, I listened with mixed feelings to the dense hail of bullets sweeping past, while bits of wire and splinters plunged into the lip of the crater. After half an hour, when the firing had died down, I worked my way over our entanglements and jumped into the trench, where a joyful welcome was ready for me. Wolgemut and Bartles were there already, and after another half hour, Berkner turned up too. There was a general rejoicing over our lucky escape. The only regret was that a prisoner had again slipped through our fingers. When I lay down on the bedboards in the dugout, I realized that my nerves had been touched. My teeth were chattering, and, exhausted though I was, I could not sleep. Next morning, I could scarcely walk. I had torn one knee on the wire, and the other had a splinter in it from the bomb Bartles had chucked at me. These brief and sporting interludes were, all the same, a good tonic for the nerves, and a relief from the monotony of trench life. On the 11th of August, a black horse was galloping to and fro behind the English lines in front of Barrels-à-Bois. A landwersman brought it down with 3 shots. The English officer from whom it had run away must have made a very sorry face at this sight. During the night, the case of a rifle bullet hit Fusilier S in the eye. In the village, too, casualties were more and more frequent. The walls were leveled by artillery fire, and there was less and less cover against the random bursts of machine gun fire. We began to connect up the villages with trenches, and to build up walls at the most dangerous spots. The 12th of August was the long-desired day when I got my second leave. However, I had scarcely got home and made myself comfortable when a telegram came after me. Return immediately. Further orders from the town major, Cambrai. 3 hours later, I was sitting in the train. On the way to the station, I met 3 girls in light summer dresses, with tennis rackets in their hands, laughing as they went. It was a brilliant farewell life gave me, and one that I often thought of when I was back in the line. On the 21st, I was once more in the well-known neighborhood. The roads, owing to the departure of the 111th Division and the arrival of the new one, were thronged with troops. The 1st Battalion lay in Ucois-Saint-Maine, which we stormed 2 years later. I spent the night in the attic of an empty house with 8 other officers. In the evening, we sat up a long while drinking coffee that 2 Frenchwomen made for us in a neighboring house. It was the strongest drink we could procure. We knew that we were on the verge this time of a battle such as the world has never seen. Soon, our excited talk rose to a pitch that would have rejoiced the heart of any freebooters, or of Frederick's grenadiers. A few days later, there were very few of that party still alive. Guillemont. On the 23rd of August, we were transported in lorries to Les Mesnil. Our spirits were excellent, though we knew we were going to be put where the Battle of the Somme was at its worst. Chaff and laughter went from lorry to lorry. We marched from Les Mesnil at dusk to Sailly-Cesnel, and here the battalion dumped packs in a large meadow and paraded in battle order. Artillery fire of hitherto unimagined intensity rolled and thundered on our front. Thousands of twitching flashes turned the western horizon into a sea of flowers. All the while, the wounded came trailing back with white, dejected faces, huddled into ditches by the gun and ammunition columns that rattled past. A man in a steel helmet reported to me as guide to conduct my platoon to the renowned Combles, where for the time we were to be in reserve. Sitting with him at the side of the road, I asked him, naturally enough, what it was like in the line. In reply, I heard a monotonous tale of crouching all day in shell holes, with no one on either flank, and no trenches communicating with the rear, of unceasing attacks, of dead bodies littering the ground, of maddening thirst, of wounded and dying, and of a lot besides. The face, half framed by the steel rim of the helmet, was unmoved. The voice, accompanied by the sound of battle, droned on, and the impression they made on me was one of unearthly solemnity. One could see that the man had been through horror to the limit of despair, and there had learnt to despise it. Nothing was left but supreme and superhuman indifference. Where you fall, there you lie. No one can help you. No one knows whether he will come back alive. They attack every day, but they can't get through. Everybody knows it's life and death. One can fight with such fellows. We marched on along a broad paved road that showed up in the moonlight as a white band in the dark fields. In front of us, the artillery fire rose to a higher and higher pitch. Abandon hope, all ye who enter here. Soon, we had the first shells on one side of the road and the other. Talk died down and ceased. Everyone listened, with the peculiar intentness that concentrates all thoughts and sensation in the ear, for the long-drawn howl of the approaching shell. Our nerves had a particularly severe test passing Friedrichscourt, a little hamlet near Combles Cemetery, under continuous fire. As far as we could see in the darkness, Combles was utterly shot to bits. The damage seemed to be recent, judging from the amount of timber among the ruins and the contents of the houses slung over the road. We climbed over numerous heaps of debris, rather hurriedly, owing to a few shrapnel shells, and reached our quarters. They were in a large, shot-riddled house. Here, I established myself with 3 sections. The other 2 occupied the cellar of a ruin opposite. At 4 a.m., we were aroused from our rest by the fragments of bed we had collected in order to receive steel helmets. It was also the occasion of discovering a sack of coffee beans in the corner of the cellar, whereupon there followed a great brewing of coffee. After breakfast, I went out to have a look around. Heavy artillery had turned the peaceful little billeting town into a scene of desolation in the course of a day or 2. Whole houses had been flattened by single direct hits, or blown up so that the interiors of rooms hung over the chaos like the scenes on a stage. A sickly scent of dead bodies rose from many of the ruins, for many civilians had been caught in the bombardment and buried beneath the wreckage of their homes. A little girl lay dead in a pool of blood on the threshold of one of the doorways. The square in front of the ruins of a church had been particularly hard hit. Here was the entrance to the catacombs, a very ancient underground passage with recesses here and there, in which were crowded the staffs of all the units engaged. It is said that the civilians had opened up the entrance with pickaxes when the bombardment began. It had been walled up and kept secret from the Germans during the whole of their occupation. The streets were reduced to narrow paths winding circuitously around and over heaps of timber and masonry. Quantities of fruit and vegetables were going to waste in the churned-up gardens. A plentiful supply of iron rations provided us with a dinner that we cooked in the kitchen, and concluded, needless to say, with strong coffee. I then settled myself in an armchair upstairs. From letters scattered about, I saw that the house belonged to a brewer, Lesage. Cupboards and chests of drawers were thrown open. There was an overturned washstand, a sewing machine, and a perambulator. The pictures and the looking glasses on the walls were all broken. Drawers had been pulled out and emptied, and a yard deep all over the floor were underclothes, corsets, books, papers, bedroom tables, broken glass, bottles, notebooks, chair legs, coats, cloaks, lamps, curtains, window frames, doors torn from their hinges, lace, photographs, oil paintings, albums, broken boxes, hats, flower pots, and torn wallpaper, all tangled together in a wild confusion. The view through the broken window showed the square utterly deserted and plowed up by the shells, which had strewn it with the branches of the limes. The artillery fire that raged around the place without ceasing deepened the gloom of this appalling picture. Now and then, the gigantic crash of a 38-centimeter shell dominated the tumult, whereupon a hail of splinters swept through combles, clattering through the branches of the trees, or striking on the walls of the few houses that were still left standing, and bringing down the slates from the roofs. In the course of the afternoon, the firing increased to such a degree that single explosions were no longer audible. There was nothing but one terrific tornado of noise. From 7 onwards, the square and the houses round were shelled at intervals of half a minute with 15-centimeter shells. There were many duds among them, which all the same made the houses rock. We sat all this while in our cellar, round a table, on armchairs covered in silk, with our heads propped on our hands, and counted the seconds between the explosions. Our jests became less frequent, till at last the foolhardiest of us fell silent, and at 8 o'clock, 2 direct hits brought the next house down. From 9 to 10, the shelling was frantic. The earth rocked, and the sky boiled like a gigantic cauldron. Hundreds of heavy batteries were concentrated on and around combles. Innumerable shells came howling and hurtling over us. Thick smoke, ominously lit up by Varay lights, veiled everything. Heads and ears ached violently, and we could only make ourselves understood by shouting a word at a time. The power of logical thought and the force of gravity seemed alike to be suspended. One had the sense of something as unescapable and as unconditionally fated as a catastrophe of nature. An NCO of No. 3 platoon went mad. At 10, this carnival of hell gradually calmed down and passed into a steady drum fire. It was still certainly impossible to distinguish one shell from another. At 11, orders came down to parade in the square. There, we joined the 2 other platoons preparatory to marching into the line. There was a 4th platoon under Lieutenant Sivers detailed to carry rations forward. They surrounded us while we hastily got together on this risky spot and loaded us with things to eat, of which in those days were still plentiful supplies. Sivers pressed a pan full of butter on me, and shaking my hand at parting, wished me luck. Then we moved off in single file. Every man had the strictest orders to follow closely on the man in front. We had scarcely got out of the place before the guide found he had missed the way. We were compelled to turn back under heavy shrapnel fire. Next we were following, mostly at the double, a white band laid down over the open ground to give us direction. It was shot into bits. Often, we had to come to a halt at the worst moments when our guide lost his way. To lie down was forbidden, in case we lost touch. In spite of this, number 1 and 3 platoons suddenly vanished. On again. We got to a sunken road, much shelled, where the sections stowed themselves. Lie down was the order. A nauseous and oppressive scent warned us that this road had claimed many a victim. After a run that threatened death at every step, we reached a second sunken road in which battle headquarters were concealed. Then, we went the wrong way and had to turn back, nerve-wracking and crowding on each other. 5 meters, at the utmost, from Vogel and myself, a medium heavy shell struck the rear bank of the road with a dull crash, and shot a volley of great clods on us, while its dead fragments flew in a shower over our backs. At last, the guide found the way again. He had come upon a surprising landmark, a group of dead bodies. On and on! Some of the men collapsed as they ran, for we were compelled to force the last ounce from their exhausted bodies. Wounded men called to us, on left and right, from the shell holes, and were disregarded. On and on, with our eyes fixed on the man in front, along a knee-deep trench formed of linked-up shell holes of enormous size, where the dead were almost touching. Our feet found little purchase against their soft and yielding bodies. Even the wounded who fell by the way shared the same fate, and were trodden beneath the boots of those who still hurried on. And always this sickly smell. Even my orderly, little Schmidt, my companion in many a dangerous patrol, began to reel. I snatched the rifle from his hand, even though at such a moment his politeness made him resist me. At last, we reached the front line. It was held by men cowering close in the shell holes, and their dead voices trembled with joy when they heard that we were the relief. A Bavarian sergeant major briefly handed over the sector and a Varet light pistol. My platoon front formed the right wing of the position held by the regiment. It consisted of a shallow, sunken road which had been pounded by shells. It was a few hundred meters left of Guillemont, and a rather shorter distance right of Bois de Trones. We were parted from the troops on our right, the 76th Regiment of Infantry, by a space about 500 meters wide. This space was shelled so violently that no troops could maintain themselves there. The Bavarian sergeant major had vanished of a sudden, and I stood alone, the Varet light pistol in my hand, in the midst of an uncanny sea of shell holes, over which lay a white mist whose swaths gave it an even more oppressive and mysterious appearance. A persistent, unpleasant smell came from behind. I was left in no doubt that it came from a gigantic corpse far gone in decay. As I had no idea how far off the enemy were, I warned my men to be ready for the worst. We all remained on guard. I spent the night with my batmen and 2 orderlies in a hole perhaps 1 yard square and 1 yard deep. When day dawned, we were astonished to see, by degrees, what a sight surrounded us. The sunken road now appeared as nothing but an enormous sea of shell holes filled with pieces of uniform, weapons, and dead bodies. The ground all around, as far as the eye could see, was plowed by shells. You could search in vain for one wretched blade of grass. This churned-up battlefield was ghastly. Among the living lay the dead. One company after another had been shoven into the drum fire and steadily annihilated. The corpses were covered with masses of soil turned up by the shells, and the next company advanced in the place of the fallen. The sunken road and the ground behind was full of German dead, the ground in front of English. Arms, legs, and heads stuck out stark above the lips of the craters. In front of our miserable defenses, There were torn off limbs and corpses, over many of which cloaks and ground sheets had been thrown to hide the fixed stare of their distorted features. In spite of the heat, no one thought for a moment of covering them with soil. The village of Guillemont was distinguished from the landscape around it only because the shell holes there were of a whiter color by reason of the houses which had been ground to powder. Guillemont railway station lay in front of us. It was smashed to bits like a child's plaything. Delville Wood, reduced to matchwood, was further behind. Day had scarcely dawned when an English flying man descended on us in a steep spin and circled round incessantly like a bird of prey, while we made for our holes and cowered there. Nevertheless, the observer's sharp eyes must have spied us, for a siren sounded its deep, long-drawn notes above us at short intervals. After a little while, it appeared that a battery had received the signal. One heavy shell after another came at us on a flat trajectory with incredible fury. We crouched in our refuges and could do nothing. Now and then we lit a cigar and threw it away again. Every moment we expected a rush of earth to bury us. The sleeve of Schmidt's coat was torn by a big splinter. At the third shot, the occupant of the hole next to mine was buried by a terrific explosion. We dug him out instantly, but the weight of the earth had killed him. His face had fallen in and looked like a death's head. It was Volunteer Simon. Tribulation had made him wise. Whenever, the course of the day, when the airmen were about, anyone stirred from his cover, Simon was heard scolding, and his warning fist appeared from behind the ground sheet that curtained the earth. At 3 p.m, the men came in from the left flank and said they could stick it no longer, as their shelters were shot to bits. It cost me all my callousness to get them back to their posts. Just before 10 at night, the left flank of the regimental front was heavily shelled, and after 20 minutes we came in for it too. In a brief space we were completely covered in dust and smoke, and yet most of the hits were just in front or just behind. While this hurricane was raging, I went along my platoon front. The men were standing, rifle in hand, as though carved in stone, their eyes fixed on the ground in front of them. Now and then, by the light of a rocket, I saw the gleam of helmet after helmet, bayonet after bayonet, and I was filled with pride at commanding this handful of men that might very well likely be pounded into the earth, but could not be conquered. It is in such moments that the human spirit triumphs over the mightiest demonstrations of material force. The fragile body, steeled by the will, stands up to the most terrific punishment. Sergeant Major H., the unfortunate rat-catcher at Monchy, who was with the platoon on our left, intended to fire a white Varay light. By mistake, he fired a red one, and this signal was taken up on all sides. At once our barrage came down to a tune which delighted us. One shell after another went howling over our heads and crashed into sparks and splinters over the ground in front of us. A mixture of dust, suffocating gases, and vaporous exhalations of corpses flung high in the air was blown back on us from the shell holes. After this orgy of destruction, the fire returned to its customary level and stayed there all night and the next day. One man in the moment of agitation had released the whole mighty machinery of war. H remained what he was, an unlucky fellow. That same night, he shot a Varay light into the leg of his boot while reloading the pistol, and had to be carried back severely burnt. Next day it rained hard, and we were not sorry. With the laying of the dust, the parched feeling was relieved, and the great clusters of blue bottles which the sun had brought out were driven away. I sat nearly all day in front of my earth on the ground, smoking, and eating too, with appetite, in spite of my surroundings. The next morning, Fusilier Nicke of my platoon got a bullet from somewhere through the chest. It hit the spine too, and paralyzed his legs. When I went to see him, he was lying in one of the shelter holes quite resigned. In the evening, when he was being carried back, he had a leg broken on one of the many occasions when his bearers had to take cover, from the shell fire. He died at the dressing station. At midday, a man of my platoon got me to have a shot at a single Englishman in Guillemont railway station. When I looked, I saw hundreds of English hurrying forward along a shallow communication trench. They were not particularly upset by the rifle fire we could bring to bear on them. This sight showed the unequal terms on which we fought, for if we had ventured on anything like it, our men would have been shot to pieces in a few minutes. While on our side not a captive balloon was to be seen, on the English side there were 30 at once over one spot, observing every movement with Argus eyes, and at once directing a hail of iron upon it. In the evening, a big shell splinter came hurtling for my stomach, but fortunately it was pretty well spent, and fell to the ground after striking the buckle of my belt. 2 members of an English ration party who had lost their way appeared at dusk on a No. 1 platoon front. Both were shot down at point-blank range. One of them half fell into the sunken road, while his legs remained on the top of the ditch. None of the men would take prisoners, for how could we get them through the barrage? It was bad enough on our own men without prisoners to see to. Towards 1 in the morning I was roused from a confused sleep by Schmidt. I jumped up nervously and seized my rifle. It was our relief. We handed over what there was to hand over, and departed with all speed from this corner of hell. We had scarcely reached the shallow communication trench when the first group of shrapnel burst among us. The man in front of me reeled from a wound in the wrist from which the blood spurted. He wanted to fall out and lay down. I caught him by the arm and got him to his feet in spite of his dazed condition, and did not let him go till I handed him over in the dressing station near battle headquarters. It was hot work in both of the sunken roads, and we got quite out of breath. The tightest corner of all was when we found ourselves in a hollow where shrapnel and light shells were coming over all the time. Birch! Birch! The rain of iron crashed around us, scattering a shower of sparks in the darkness. Hooey! Another volley! We stopped, breathless, for I knew a fraction of a second in advance, from the sharpening intensity of the sound, that the descending curve of the shell would end just where I stood. Immediately after, there was a heavy crash at my very feet, and the soft earth was flung high. This one, of all others, was a dud. A better opportunity could not be wished for making the influence of an officer tell. Everywhere, relieved and reliefs were hurrying through the shells into the darkness, some of them utterly lost and dazed with excitement and exhaustion. Everywhere voices rang out, in command, or in monotonous supplication from the shell holes where the wounded were left to their fate. As we rushed by, I gave information to those who had lost their way, pulled men out of shell holes, threatened to shoot any who wanted to fall out, kept shouting my name to keep my men together, and at last, as though by a miracle, I got my platoon back to Combles. From Combles, we still had to march beyond Sailly in the government farm to the forest of Hinois, where we were to biovac, and now our exhausted condition made itself felt in earnest. We shuffled bitterly along the road with hanging heads. Motor cars and ammunition columns crowded us into the ditch. In a kind of nervous distemper, I was convinced that the transport rattling by pushed us to one side so roughly only out of spite. And more than once, I surprised myself with my finger on the trigger of my revolver. When our march was done, we still had tents to pitch before we could throw ourselves down on the hard ground. During our time under canvas in this forced biovac, there were heavy downfalls of rain. The straw in the tents began to rot, and several of the men went sick. We 5 company officers were little put out by the dampness. Every evening we sat on our kit bags under canvas, behind a battery of bottles. We went back to Combles after 3 days, where I occupied, with my platoon, 4 smallish cellars. The first morning it was comparatively quiet, so I took a little walk through the devastated gardens and plundered an espalier of some delicious peaches. On my wanderings, I got into a house surrounded by tall hedges, where a lover of beautiful old things must have lived. On the walls of the rooms there was a collection of painted plates, such as they love in northern France, holy water basins, copper plate engravings, and nativities carved in wood. There were stores of old china, and lovely old leather bindings were scattered about the floor, a fine old Don Quixote among them. It was a pity to leave all these treasures to destruction. When I got back, I found that the men had marauded the garden on their own account, and had now made a stew of bully and vegetables, in which there were potatoes, beans, carrots, artichokes, and many kinds of green vegetable. While we were eating, a shell hit the house, and 3 flew close by. But we paid little attention, for the surfeit of such sensations had blunted us. The house must have seen some casualties already, for a newly carved cross stood on a heap of debris in the middle room, with a list of names carved in the wood. At noon on the next day, I went to the house of the collector of china, and got a volume of the illustrated Petit Journal. It is to be found in nearly every French household, and it abounds in villainous bad taste. I then established myself in a room that still held together, lit a small fire of broken furniture, and began to read. I often had to shake my head, for I had stumbled on the numbers printed while the Fashoda affair was on. At about 7, I turned the last page and went into a little room at the top of the cellar steps, where the men were cooking at a little fireplace. I had scarcely joined them when there was a loud report in front of the door of the house, and at the same moment I felt a violent blow on my left calf. Shouting out that I was hit, I jumped down the cellar steps with my pipe still in my mouth. A light was lit in a moment, and the matter looked into. There was a ragged hole in my puttees, from which blood ran onto the ground. On the other side, there was a round swelling of a shrapnel bullet under the skin. The men bound me up and took me under fire to the catacombs, where our surgeon major general took me in hand. Lieutenant White, who happened to be passing by, held my head while the bullet was cut out with knife and scissors. The surgeon congratulated me, for the bullet had passed between the shin and the fibula without any injury to the bone. Habent su fata libelli at baili, remarked the old corps student with a grunt, as he handed me over to an orderly to be dressed. To my great joy, many of my men came to say goodbye to me while I lay on a stretcher in a recess of the catacombs waiting for dusk. My honored colonel, von Oppen, too, paid me a visit. When evening came, I was carried to the outskirts of town and put on a Red Cross wagon. The driver, without paying any heed to the cries of the occupants, went at full speed over the paved road, for it was being shelled, and neither shell holes nor other obstructions could stop him. Finally, we were taken on by motor to the village of Fins, and laid in the church, which was already crowded with wounded. A nurse told me that over 30,000 wounded had passed through Fins in the last few days. In the face of such figures, I could not think much of the wound in my leg. From there, I got to St. Quentin, whose windows shook in the incessant thunder of battle, and then again in the hospital train to Guerra, where I received the best possible attention in the garrison hospital. I heard the subsequent fate of my company from my friends in the other battalions who were wounded after I was. It was put back into line on the day after I got my wound, and suffered severe losses marching up, and also during 10 hours' drum fire. It was then attacked from all sides, owing to the large gaps in the line. Little Schmidt, Fanrik Wolgmuth, Lieutenants Vogels and Sievers, in fact, nearly the whole company, had died fighting to the last. A few survivors only, Lieutenant White among them, were taken prisoners. Not one man got back to Combles to tell the tale of this heroic fight that was fought to the finish with such bitterness. Even the English Army Command made honorable mention of the handful of men who held out to the last near Guillemont. was no doubt glad of the chance shot that withdrew me as if by a miracle from certain death on the very eve of the engagement. At the same time, strange as it may sound, I would willingly have shared the fate of my comrades and stood with them shoulder to shoulder while the iron dice of war rolled over us. Instead of this, I kept the unquenchable flame of these men as my reminder, in the worst moments of the sanguinary conflicts that were yet in store, that I must show myself always worthy to have been their comrade. It was the days at Guillemont that first made me aware of the overwhelming effects of the war of material. We had to adapt ourselves to an entirely new phase of the war. The communications between the troops and the staff, between the artillery and the liaison officers, were utterly crippled by the terrific fire. Dispatch carriers failed to get through the hail of metal, and telephone wires were no sooner laid than they were shot into pieces. Even light signaling was put out of action by the clouds of smoke and dust that hung over the front of the battle. There was a zone of a kilometer behind the front line where explosives held absolute sway. Even the regimental staff only knew exactly where we had been and how the line ran when we came back after 3 days and told them. Under such circumstances, accuracy of artillery fire was out of the question. We were also entirely in the dark about the English line, though often, without our knowing it, it was only a few meters from us. Sometimes a Tommy, feeling his way from one shell hole to another, like an ant along a track in the sand, landed in one that we occupied, and vice versa, for our front line consisted merely of isolated and unconnected bits that were easily mistaken. Once seen, the landscape is an unforgettable one. In this neighborhood of villages, meadows, woods, and fields, there was literally not a bush or a tiniest blade of grass to be seen. Every hand's breadth of ground had been churned up again and again. Trees had been uprooted, smashed, and ground to touchwood. The houses blown to bits and turned to dust. Hills had been leveled, and the arable land made a desert. And yet, the strangest thing of all was not the horror of the landscape in itself, but the fact that these scenes, such as the world has never known, were fashioned by men who intended them to be a decisive end to the war. Thus, all the frightfulness that the mind of man could devise was brought into the field, and there, where lately there had been the idyllic picture of rural peace, there was as a faithful picture of the soul of scientific war. In earlier wars, certainly, towns and villages had been burned, but what was that compared with the sea of craters dug out by the machines? For even in this fantastic desert, there was the sameness of the machine-made article. A shell hole strewn with bully tins, broken weapons, fragments of uniform, and dud shells, with 1 or 2 bodies on its edge. This was the never-changing scene that surrounded each one of all these hundreds of thousands of men. And it seemed that man, on this landscape he himself had created, became different, more mysterious and hardy and callous than in any previous battle. The spirit and tempo of the fighting altered, and after the Battle of the Somme, the war had its own peculiar impress that distinguished it from all other wars. After this battle, the German soldier wore the steel helmet, and in his features there was chiseled the lines of any energy stretched to the utmost pitch, lines that future generations will perhaps find as fascinating and imposing as those of many heads of classical or Renaissance times. For I cannot too often repeat, a battle was no longer an episode that spent itself in blood and fire. It was a condition of things that dug itself in remorselessly, week after week, and month after month. What was a man's life in this wilderness whose vapor was laden with the stench of thousands upon thousands of decaying bodies? Death lay in ambush for each one in every shell hole, merciless, and making one merciless in turn. Chivalry here took a final farewell. It had to yield to the heightened intensity of war, just as all fine personal feeling is to yield when machinery get the upper hand. The Europe of today appeared here for the first time on the field of battle. The terrible losses, out of all proportion to the breadth of front attacked, were principally due to the old Prussian obstinacy with which the tactics of the line were pursued to their logical conclusion. One battalion after another was crowded up into the front line, already overmanned, and in a few hours pounded to bits. It was a long while before the folly of contesting worthless strips of ground was recognized. It was finally given up, and the principle of a mobile defense adopted. The last development of this was the elastic distribution of the defense in zones. Thus it was that there were never again such bitterly contested engagements as those that for weeks together were fought out round shot shell woods or undecipherable ruins. The names of the tiniest Picardy hamlets are memorials of heroic battles to which the history of the world can find no parallel. There it was that the dust first drank the blood of our trained and disciplined youth. Those fine qualities which had raised the German race to greatness leapt up once more in dazzling flame, and then slowly went out in a sea of mud and blood.